On the night of the 25th of August 2011, a 3-year-old woman named Risa Dura and her husband Hioki Dura were sitting together on their couch. They were in their apartment in Kanazawa City, Japan, and they were just watching some TV. And as they sat there, they were both laughing hysterically at what was on the screen. It was their absolute favorite show, a hidden camera comedy prank show. For them, this was the perfect way to end the day, just sitting here together on the couch, laughing their heads off. Risa and Hioki had only been married for 4 months. They were still deep in that newlywed bliss period where they spent basically every possible second they could with each other. When Hioki wasn't at work, the two of them were always out and about. They'd go out to eat at their favorite restaurants, they'd go to the movies, or they'd take little day trips to the beach, since Kanazawa City was right there on the coast. And whenever they were out, they were constantly talking about how lucky they felt. They truly believed they had found their perfect match in each other. They were married, and this was what the rest of their lives was going to look like. Just being together, happy. They felt like the luckiest people in the world. Risa and Hioki had actually known each other for a long time. They first met when they were just kids in middle school. But back then, Hioki was extremely shy. He was so quiet that he really didn't speak to Risa at all. He had a crush on her, but he never let it show. So, nothing ever came of it. But then, years later, after they had both finished college and were starting their adult lives, they just happened to run into each other again. And this time, Hioki, who was still a bit shy but had grown more confident, decided he had to tell Risa the truth. He confessed to her that he had always loved her all the way back in middle school, and that he still did. Risa was totally shocked by this. She had always kind of felt something for him too, but because he was so quiet, it just never seemed like he was interested in her at all. So to her, this was this incredible revelation, but it was more than just a surprise. It was incredibly romantic. It felt like something out of a classic Hollywood love story. This quiet boy she knew from her childhood had been harboring this secret love for her all these years. And so, when he finally confessed his feelings, she pretty much immediately said yes to a date. She was so excited, and from that very first date, it was just a total whirlwind. They fell completely and totally in love, and within a year, they were married. They ended up settling in Kanazawa City mostly because of Hioki's job. He worked for a company that was based in the city, and he was doing really well there. He was considered a rising star. Every time Risa would meet one of his coworkers, they would rave about him. They'd say what a hard worker he was, what a natural-born leader he was becoming. Risa was so proud of him. But more than that, she felt inspired by his drive and his passion for his work. It made her want to find a really fulfilling job for herself, something she could be just as passionate about. So, she was actively on the hunt for her own career. But for the moment, Risa was still in that phase of trying to figure out exactly what she wanted to do. She had so many interests and was always jumping from one thing to another. She had this huge, insatiable curiosity about the world, and she absolutely loved trying new things. This was a wonderful quality, but it also made it really hard for her to choose just one single path for her life. But Hioki was incredibly supportive through all of it. He treated Risa like she was royalty. He always told her that whatever she wanted to do was completely fine by him as long as it made her happy. He just wanted to see her smile. So for now, as Risa sat on the couch next to Hioki, laughing at this funny show, her mind started to wander. It drifted away from the television and away from her ongoing job search and landed on Hioki's birthday. It was coming up very soon, and she felt this immense pressure to do something really, really special for him. A big part of that pressure came from the fact that Hioki always did something incredibly thoughtful and amazing for her. For her birthday, for any special occasion, he really knew how to celebrate her and make her feel loved. She didn't want to underwhelm him with her gift. Plus, this was going to be the first time either of them had a birthday now that they were officially married. So Risa wanted to go all out. She wanted to plan something that Hioki would never, ever forget. But as she sat there on the couch trying to brainstorm the perfect birthday celebration, she just kept drawing a blank. It felt like the only thing she could really focus on that they shared was their romantic nature. They were both very romantic people. So whatever she did, it had to be romantic in some way. But how? She wasn't sure. In many ways, she and her husband were very different in how they expressed their affection. Hioki was still that quiet, reserved person he'd always been. His displays of affection were usually very reserved and private just for her. But Risa, on the other hand, was a massive extrovert. She was full of energy, and so her displays of affection were often over the top, big, and boisterous. So Risa was really struggling, trying to think of how she could combine their two styles of romance into one perfect celebration. And then, all of a sudden, it was like she had an epiphany. She saw it perfectly in her mind's eye. The perfect way to celebrate his birthday. She didn't even know what had inspired it, it just came to her in a flash. She would take her husband out for a very romantic walk on the beach at night. But then, at the end of the walk, there would be this huge surprise. An over-the-top fireworks display just for him. It was the perfect idea. It was romantic, and it was a little crazy, just like her. 2 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, Risa and 6 of her friends were at Osaki Beach. This was the beach where the big birthday surprise was going to happen that very night. Risa had spent the previous day, while Hioki was at work, planning out all the details of the party. But now, on the day of, there was some actual physical setup that needed to be done. This wasn't just going to be a walk on the beach with some fireworks. There was another element to her plan, a secret prank element, and she needed her friends' help for that. So, on this afternoon, they were walking along the beach looking for the perfect spot. The spot needed to do 2 things. First, it had to afford Risa and her husband some privacy, so it would feel very romantic and intimate. But it also needed to have a good vantage point for her friends, a place where they could hide and watch the couple. They needed to be able to see Risa's signal so they would know exactly when to light the fireworks. And so Risa and her friends are walking along the sand, scanning the coastline, and then they see it. There was this private, sort of secluded section of the beach that had a long row of thick shrubbery lining the back of it. It was perfect. The bushes would be a perfect hiding spot for her friends. And the beach itself, down on the sand, was nice and private and peaceful. They all agreed this was the best spot for the big party. So, they got to work. Her friends went up into the bushes and started getting their fireworks ready, figuring out the best way to set them up for a quick launch. Meanwhile, Risa went down to the sandy part of the beach and she prepped the area where she and Hioki would be standing. The final touch was laying out a big blue sheet on the sand. This would be their mark, the spot where they needed to be for the surprise to work perfectly. Once the blue sheet was in place, she walked back up to her friends in the bushes. They all confirmed that everything was ready to go. Risa told her friends the plan was to be back there that night at exactly 10 p.m. with her husband. She told them they should probably get there a little bit earlier, just to make sure they were all set up and hidden. They all agreed, and then they packed up and left the beach. As Risa left the beach that afternoon, she found herself feeling incredibly antsy. She was just so excited about this big surprise party she had planned for that night. She just wanted it to be 10 p.m. already so she could finally reveal everything she had in store for Hioki. But she also knew she had to play it cool. She couldn't give away any hint that she had this big surprise planned. So, when she got back home where Hioki was waiting, she acted like everything was totally normal. When she walked inside, she told Hioki to just go relax on the couch while she made them both a very nice dinner. She wanted to pamper him a little bit. When dinner was ready, the two of them sat down at the table. Risa pretended like she had absolutely nothing planned for his birthday weekend. She casually asked him, "Hey, what should we do this weekend to celebrate your birthday?" They talked about maybe going to see some friends or going out to a movie, just brainstorming ideas. But of course, it was all a big act. Risa knew exactly what they were doing that night. Later, when it was getting kind of late and it seemed like Hioki was maybe thinking about heading to bed, Risa made her move. She said, "Wait a minute. It's your birthday weekend. Let's not go to bed just yet. Let's go for a walk on the beach. What a great romantic idea that would be. Hioki was a little surprised by the suggestion, it being so late, but he thought about it for a second and then said, actually, yeah, that sounds great. Let's go for it. As soon as he said yes, Risa could barely contain her excitement. She knew she had this amazing, incredible thing planned for him down at the beach, and it was about to happen. This was going to be awesome. And so, she and her husband quickly cleaned up the dinner dishes. And then, just before 10 p.m., they left their apartment, got in their car, and started heading to the beach. About 10 minutes later, they parked at the end of a dead-end road right near the beach. When they got out of the car, they were surrounded by bushes on all sides of the road. But there was a little sandy path that cut through the bushes and led down to the open beach. As Risa led Hioki down this path and onto the sand, she quickly realized she had a very big problem. There was virtually no moonlight. The sky was overcast, and it was basically pitch black out on the beach. This was a huge issue. Remember, she had put out that blue blanket to mark the exact spot where she and Hioki needed to be. It was their position marker, so that her friends, who were hidden nearby in the bushes, would know when and where to light off the fireworks. The entire plan, the entire surprise, was contingent on them getting to that blue blanket. And it was so dark that not only was Risa unable to see the blue blanket from a distance, she could barely even see the sand right in front of her feet. It was so dark, it was almost eerie out there. And you have to remember, this was in 2011. You couldn't just pull out your cell phone and turn on a powerful flashlight. That feature didn't really exist yet. So the best they could do was to pull out their phones, tap on the screen to wake them up, and use the little bit of light coming from the home screen to try and guide their way. After walking on the beach for just a short ways, Hioki actually stopped Risa. He said, "Hey, I don't think it's safe to be walking on the beach right now. We really can't see where we're going at all. Let's go back to the car and see if we have a flashlight." But Risa knew her friends were already in position. They were waiting in those shrubs down the beach, ready to light off those fireworks. And she figured they probably couldn't see very well either. She started to worry that if she and Hioki didn't get to the spot soon, her friends might panic. Maybe they'd think something was wrong, or maybe they'd light off the fireworks prematurely. She didn't know what might happen, but she was starting to get worried that her whole perfect plan was falling apart. She couldn't afford to be late. And so she told her husband, "No, let's not go back for flashlights. Let's just keep walking. It's no big deal. The sand is flat." And so the two of them continued walking along the beach, holding up their dimly lit cell phone screens to try and guide them. But pretty quickly, Hioki started to notice that Risa seemed really anxious, and she was walking way too fast. This was supposed to be a peaceful, romantic walk on the beach, but Risa was walking like a woman on a mission. She was striding ahead of him, clearly trying to get somewhere specific. But he didn't understand where she was trying to go. Finally, he called out to her and said, "Hey, what's going on? Why are you walking so quickly? What are we doing out here?" And so finally, she just stopped. She turned and looked at her husband, and she was about to tell him what was actually going on. She felt like the surprise was ruined at this point anyway, and she basically needed his help if they were ever going to find this blanket and figure out where they needed to be. But right as Risa opened her mouth to tell her husband what was going on, suddenly, it was like the whole world went completely black. There was no more ambient light from their cell phones, no more minimal moonlight, nothing. Just absolute blackness and then a sudden, jarring silence. At that exact same time, Risa's friends were not that far away, hiding up in the bushes just like they had planned. But, much like Risa and Hioki, they had also been dealing with the problem of not being able to see anything. It was so incredibly dark. They had gotten into position, but they couldn't even see the sand clearly from where they were hiding. They had absolutely no idea if Risa and Hioki were in position or not. But they could hear them. They could hear the faint sound of Risa and Hioki talking, somewhere out there on the sand in the darkness. The friends were whispering back and forth to each other in the bushes. How are we going to know when they're actually in position? How are we going to get the signal to light off the fireworks? We can't see them at all, and so the friends were feeling really unsure about what to do. They were straining their eyes, peering out onto the dark sand, trying to see Risa, trying to see Hioki. But again, they couldn't see them. They couldn't even see the blue blanket that they knew wasn't that far away. And so they were just looking and listening, and they could kind of tell that the voices they were hearing were probably Risa and Hioki. And it sounded like they were moving in their general direction. But then, suddenly, they heard screams. The screams were coming from the same direction as the voices they believed were their friends. At first, for just a split second, they thought the screams might actually be the signal, like a loud, crazy signal to light off the fireworks. But the screams didn't sound happy. They sounded like somebody was in serious trouble. And critically, as soon as the screaming started, it abruptly stopped. It was just a couple of high-pitched, awful screams, and then total silence. Absolute, total silence on the beach. And again, they couldn't see anything. So, they had no idea what was going on. They didn't even know for sure if that was Risa and Hioki, but they had a terrible feeling that something was wrong. So, they abandoned the fireworks plan completely. They left their hiding spot in the bushes and they charged out onto the beach. They were looking all around, shouting their friends' names, but they still really couldn't see anything. They couldn't even find the blue blanket, and they knew roughly where it was supposed to be. And so they're running around the beach in the dark. They're calling out for Hioki and Risa, but they're not hearing anything back. For a full 30 minutes, they were just running around in a panic, looking for their friends, just knowing in their gut that something bad had just happened. And then, at some point, one of the friends doubled back. They went roughly to the area where they knew the blue blanket was supposed to be. And that's when they made a discovery. It would turn out that when Risa and Hioki were out on that beach, walking around in the total darkness, Risa actually did find the blue sheet that she had set up. Except it was so dark that even though they were, at one point, literally standing on the blanket, she and Hioki couldn't even tell it was that dark. Now, that might not seem like it would be catastrophic until you consider what was underneath that blanket. So, 2 days earlier, when Risa had her big epiphany about how to create the best birthday ever for Hioki, she had been inspired in part by the show they were watching on TV. That hidden camera comedy show that she and Hioki both loved. The show was called Arashi's Big Secret, and its comedy really came from the over-the-top pranks that the show's hosts would pull on Japanese celebrities. And one of those pranks, a recurring one, was to dig a large hole on the beach, cover it up, and then trick somebody into accidentally falling into it. And so Risa thought, what a great idea. What if I dig a hole on the beach, cover it up, and then after our romantic walk, I'll have Hioki fall into the hole as a funny prank. And then my friends will immediately fire off those fireworks. It'll be like he's on the game show that we love so much. It was supposed to be a perfect combination of a romantic, fun time on the beach, a harmless prank, and then a big birthday celebration afterwards. It was, in her mind, the perfect plan. However, Risa had made a terrible, fatal miscalculation. On the game show, when they would dig these holes in the beach, they would cover them with a very specific material. It was basically dried foam, almost like styrofoam. The instant one of their contestants or celebrities stepped directly on the foam, it would immediately break and they would fall safely, feet first, into the hole. But what Risa did was different. After she and her friends dug this deep hole, getting ready for the big party, she covered it first with a thick, rigid piece of plastic. It was almost like a thin sheet of plywood, but made of hard plastic. So she covered the hole with that, and that was the platform. And then she covered that platform with the blue sheet so that to the naked eye, it just looked like the ground was level underneath. In Risa's mind, this rigid piece of plastic would break the instant her husband stepped on it. She thought it wasn't that strong. Maybe it was strong enough to hold him for a second, but it would definitely snap in the middle and he would fall in, just like on the show. But in reality, when she and her husband inadvertently walked onto that blue sheet without even realizing it because it was so dark, that piece of plastic didn't break. It was too rigid. Instead of breaking, the plastic just suddenly tilted to one side. It acted like a trapdoor. This caused both Risa and her husband to suddenly tumble forward, both of them headfirst into this deep hole. And as they fell, their weight on the edge of the hole caused a massive avalanche of sand to pour in from all sides, completely covering the two of them up. And so Risa and Hioki, they screamed for just a second as they began to fall into the ground. And then suddenly, they were upside down and completely buried all the way to the top by heavy, wet sand. That's why it went silent after the screams. It was because they were completely buried alive. Risa's friends, after searching the beach after hearing those screams, they would eventually find the blue blanket. It was partially submerged in the sand. They really didn't know what had happened, but because of the screams and what they were now seeing, they just immediately called the authorities. When the emergency crews came out to the beach, it would take them nearly 30 minutes to finally dig Risa and Hioki out from that hole. But by that point, it was far too late. They had both suffocated to death. One morning, in the winter of 1856, a 27-year-old explorer named Dr. Edward Fogel sat down for breakfast. He was at the home where he was staying in the city of Abashir, which was in a kingdom called Wadai in Central Africa. Edward poured himself a cup of milk, and then, even though the table in front of him was full of warm breads and cakes and porridge, Edward called a servant over. He asked her to please get him a plate of boiled eggs. But the servant just apologized and explained, "I'm very sorry, but we don't have any eggs this morning. We are all out." Edward was disappointed, but he just thanked the servant anyway, and she left. Edward was visiting Africa from his home country of Germany. He was on a map-making expedition, and he'd been staying in Abashir for the past 2 weeks. So far, all the local food he had tried really upset his stomach. Everything except for eggs. So, for literally every single meal since he had arrived, the only thing he would eat was eggs. And now, because they were out of eggs, despite there being all this other perfectly good food to choose from, he knew he couldn't eat it without getting sick. And so, he would just have to go hungry. But outside of the food issue, overall, Edward thought the city of Abashir was okay. He had been given the chance to meet the king, who had then arranged for him to stay in this very nice home that was owned by a local noble family. And the area itself was extremely beautiful. Edward was on track to be the very first European to successfully make a detailed map of it, which meant that he would essentially be creating history. But Edward just really was not getting along with the local people. They seemed to him to be kind of suspicious of him for no reason, and Edward couldn't believe it. They didn't seem to care at all that he was this famous map maker who had come all the way there from Germany to literally put their, what he considered to be, insignificant city onto the map of the whole world. Why didn't they appreciate that? He just couldn't understand it. And now, adding insult to injury, Edward couldn't even eat any breakfast. And so, feeling pretty annoyed, despite all the effort the family had clearly made to feed him that morning, Edward stood up from the table and he left to go spend the day exploring. He walked out into the front courtyard of the home, where another servant was waiting with Edward's horse. Edward spent most of his days in the city just kind of riding around and drawing maps of the streets and the alleyways. But today, this servant warned Edward that he really ought to stay inside. The servant told him it was not safe for him to go out into the city today. At this point in time, the kingdom that Abashir was a part of was at war with several neighboring nations. And so, as a result, everybody in the city was very worried about spies. This meant they were extremely suspicious of any foreigners, like Edward. Now, for the most part, the locals had sort of put up with his presence so far, but to them, it just seemed like he was always watching them, always writing in his notebook, but never talking to anyone. And so they had started to gossip about him. But Edward, after being given this warning by the servant, did not take it seriously at all. Instead, he kind of scoffed and said, it's no big deal. I'm not going to be out there for very long anyways. Nothing's going to happen. He then told the servant that he had another plan for the day. His big plan was to leave the city of Abashir and go to this nearby mountain. He wanted to climb up the mountain and get a bird's-eye view of the entire city from the top to help him finish his map. But when Edward said that, the servant looked truly horrified. He told Edward that he simply could not do that because the mountain Edward was clearly talking about was sacred. Nobody was allowed to climb it. It was a very important rule to the people who lived there. But to Edward, this warning didn't land at all. Instead, he just saw it as more evidence that the locals just didn't appreciate what he was doing for them. He was on a very important mission, a mission that was, in his mind, far more important than anything that was sacred to them. And so Edward, he thanked the servant for the warning, but also basically said, look, I'm going to do what I'm going to do because this is really important. And so he said, I'm going to go hike that mountain and I'll see you tonight when I drop off the horse. And then Edward climbed onto the horse and he rode off. But Edward didn't come back. He didn't come back that night, or the day after, or the day after that. And pretty soon, it became very clear that Edward Fogel was missing. Word of Edward's disappearance ultimately made it back to Germany pretty quickly, specifically to the Geography Society that had sent him to Africa on this map-making mission in the first place. So the Geography Society and the German public were very concerned, and they sent several search parties to Africa to go look for Edward. But despite multiple serious attempts over several years, nobody ever found him or figured out what happened to him. And because of this, Edward sort of became famous back in Germany. People began to see him as this brave explorer who thirsted for knowledge and went daringly into the unknown. They imagined all sorts of dramatic and tragic things that might have happened to him. Maybe he had been assassinated by a rival kingdom or taken prisoner. Or maybe he discovered something holy or ancient that he wasn't supposed to see. And so, in time, the story of Edward Fogel got bigger and bigger. He became like a symbol of German pride. This was our great explorer. He had done something amazing, clearly. Also adding intrigue to this already very bizarre mystery was the fact that all of the people who actually went to Africa to look for Edward, all the members of those search parties over the years, literally every single one of them died. Now, we know how those searchers died. It was due to local violence or disease or just plain bad luck. But it sort of added to the intrigue of this mystery. The idea that everybody who went looking for Edward didn't come back, that became part of the lore. And so this mystery just continued to grow and grow. It was passed around and things were embellished and things were fictionalized until finally, almost 20 years after Edward disappeared, another explorer named Gustav Nachtigall decided that he was going to be the one who finally figured out, once and for all, what actually happened to this guy. And so, in the early winter of 1874, Gustav is now in the courtyard outside of his apartment in Abashir. He had actually traveled to Africa to begin his search for the answer. What happened to Edward? And he's standing in this courtyard along with his translator, whose name was Ahmed. The two of them were sitting across from an elderly man who was friends with the current king of Abashir. This elderly man had, at one point, lived in one of the apartments across this very courtyard. And so Gustav asked this old man if he had ever met with a European man about 17 years earlier. And Ahmed translated the question for him. And the old man said, yes, he had. He remembered that one European man had come to meet with the king around that time. He said the man had always been writing in this notebook, but he had never seemed to want to speak to anybody and had, for the most part, just kept to himself. But the old man said that, beyond his general impression of the guy, he really didn't know anything about him. He had no idea what he was doing there or what ultimately happened to him. So at this point, both Gustav and Ahmed had been in Abashir for 2 months. And in that time, they had been trying to ask around and see if anybody remembered Edward. And so far, they had run into a few people who did seem to remember him, like this older man, because it was pretty rare to see a European person in the city. But unfortunately, nobody had any specific information on how or when Edward had disappeared. Or, in the rare case that they did seem to know more, they refused to talk about it. And so for Gustav, on the one hand, This was incredibly frustrating. All he wanted was the truth. But on the other hand, as he ran into more and more people who seemed apprehensive to even talk about Edward at all, that sort of suggested that maybe something really bad did happen to Edward when he was in Abashir. And if that was the case, if some horrible fate befell him, Gustav knew there was one person in this city who almost certainly would know the truth. But Gustav basically couldn't ask this one person any questions about Edward without being incredibly offensive. Because this one person was the current king of Abashir, King Ali. And it would have been his father who had met Edward and arranged for him to stay with that noble family when he was doing his map-making. And so, for Edward to have been killed or captured, or if something horrible had happened to him while he was in Abashir, well, King Ali's father would have had to have given the okay. Or he would have at least known about it and been okay with it. He would have known something, making him complicit in whatever happened to Edward. And so to ask King Ali, hey, what do you think happened to Edward? You could be potentially suggesting that his own father did something terrible. But it was more than that. What Ahmed had told Gustav was that you don't just risk offending the king by asking those questions. You might actually be executed for offending the king. And so, what Gustav decided he needed to do, because he was so dead set on trying to solve this mystery, is he still needed to find a way to talk to King Ali about Edward, but without losing his life. He had to come up with a very clever way to get this information out of the king. A few weeks later, Gustav and Ahmed had still not yet come up with a clever way to speak to the king. They couldn't figure out a way to approach the subject without horribly offending him. And so the two of them were in Gustav's apartment eating lunch when suddenly there was a knock at the door. Gustav got up, he went to the door, and when he opened it up, it was a courier. The man told Gustav that he was part of a caravan that had just arrived there from North Africa, and he had some mail for Gustav from back home. He had letters from Germany. He just handed the whole bundle of mail to Gustav. And Gustav, who did not get mail very often, was very excited. He said, "Oh, thank you." He took the mail, thanked the guy again, shut the door, and went back into the common room. And he just began going through the mail, looking to see who had sent him something. And as he was doing it, he suddenly had this great idea. It had nothing to do with what was actually written in the letters. It was just the concept of receiving mail that suddenly gave him this brilliant way to talk to the king. The very next day, Gustav and Ahmed walked into the royal palace in Abashir. When they walked in, they eventually made their way into this bright and airy courtroom. And in this courtroom, on the other end, against the far wall, was King Ali sitting on his throne. So Gustav and Ahmed immediately went over to the king, and they greeted him and they exchanged some pleasantries. And as they were doing that, Gustav, he knew that that same caravan that had come through the day before with his mail had also made a stop at the palace. He knew they had presented the king with all these lavish gifts, like a silver tea set and gold watches and all this luxurious fabric. And so Gustav was really hoping that those gifts had put the king in a really good mood, because that was a big part of his plan. At some point, after the pleasantries had stopped, Gustav actually referenced the caravan. He told the king that, in fact, they had also swung by his place and dropped off this big bundle of letters from back home. And he said he was really happy about it. And the king kind of seconded that and said, "Oh yeah, they gave me all these great gifts." Yes, it was so wonderful. And so they're kind of talking back and forth about how great this mail delivery was when Gustav tells this incredible lie to the king. He tells the king, he goes, "You know, all those letters, it was really great to hear from home, from my friends, from my family. But there was this one really weird letter in there that I didn't even know who it was from." Now, this letter didn't exist. This was a total fabrication. But he told the king that this weird letter, it was from an elderly man who had written to Gustav to tell him that his son had gone to Abashir many years ago and had never come home again. And so now, this elderly man, he knew his son was probably not alive at this point. But in this fictional letter to Gustav, he told Gustav that his son had done a lot of writing in notebooks. And he was hopeful that maybe someone in Abashir still had these notebooks. And could Gustav please get the notebooks and return them to the old man just to give him some comfort about what his son had been doing and saying and thinking before he disappeared. As soon as Gustav said this, he could actually feel the mood in the throne room shift. He could tell that King Ali was very much on edge about what Gustav might say next. But Gustav had planned for this. And he told the king that, just so you know, all throughout Europe, people think of you as a wise and just king. And so, if by chance you have these notebooks and you were to give them to me, so I can give them to this elderly man in his old age so he can have some comfort before he dies, if you would do that, the people of Europe would love you even more for that simple act of kindness. Then Gustav went quiet, and there was this really intense silence in the throne room. But then the king just kind of sat back in his throne and he smiled at Gustav. And as soon as Gustav saw that smile on the king's face, he decided he just had to do it. And he said to the king, "The son's name is Dr. Edward Fogel." And then after that, Gustav just went silent. Because he knew at this point, if the king thought he was lying or trying to trick him, he could easily be executed right here, right now. But King Ali just kept on smiling at Gustav and just said, "You know what? I will think about it." Gustav quickly thanked the king and hurried out of the throne room. And then he went back to his apartment and spent the entire night just pacing around his room, wondering what was going to happen. Part of Gustav was optimistic that maybe the king would come through here and hand over these notebooks if he really did have them. But the other part of Gustav, the more realistic side, thought that maybe what he had just done was effectively sign his own death warrant, and that soon he'd become one of the many travelers who came to Abashir and never went home. A few days later, a very nervous Gustav followed a palace guard back into the throne room. And when he got in there, he immediately saw King Ali sitting on his throne. And Gustav really couldn't read his expression. So he didn't know if the king was mad at him, if he was going to be conciliatory, if he was going to help him. He had no idea. And so Gustav just walked into the room and kind of held his breath. King Ali broke the silence. And when he did, it was clear he was not angry. He was just kind of even-keeled. And he told Gustav that after their conversation, he had gone and spoken to the noble family that Edward had stayed with when he was here. But they told him they couldn't find any of Dr. Edward's writings. They said the notebooks had either been thrown away or lost. And so, unfortunately, there was nothing to send back to Edward's elderly father. Now, Gustav did not believe this for a second. At this time, paper was very scarce. There was no way they would have been just throwing it away or destroying it. Paper was pretty valuable. But he couldn't say that to the king. So he just swallowed his disappointment and thanked the king for asking about the notebooks. And then Gustav hoped that at this point he'd be allowed to leave. But one of the guards put their hand on Gustav's shoulder and said he needed to follow him. And at this point, Gustav's stomach dropped. He assumed he was about to be taken away, to be punished for asking about Edward in the first place. And so Gustav's hands were shaking and his heart was racing as he followed the guard out of the palace and out into the courtyard. There were some horses tied up and waiting for them. Gustav felt nauseous as he followed the guard through the city streets, and he wondered if he should just try to make a break for it and try to escape. But he looked down different streets and alleys and realized that would be totally useless. The palace guards would find him in minutes. So there was nowhere for him to go. And so Gustav had no choice but to just keep on following this guard. Through the city they went. And then eventually they got to the city gates. And Gustav was horrified as they left the city and just began riding out into the wilderness over towards this huge mountain in the distance. And as they were making their way towards this mountain, all Gustav was thinking is that at any moment here, they're going to just dump me here to die, or they're going to ambush me, or something bad is going to happen. At some point, the guard led Gustav all the way to the foot of that mountain. And there, the guard abruptly stopped and climbed off his horse. He just turned around and faced Gustav. And he says, "I am going to tell you exactly what happened to Edward." And Gustav was kind of shocked by this. He really didn't know what was going to happen here. He didn't even know if he was still in danger at this point. But now he was just holding his breath, waiting for this mystery to potentially finally be solved. And so the guard, he looked at Gustav and he said, Edward committed an unforgivable crime. And he was punished for that crime. Now, at this point, Gustav was shocked. Edward was this very well-traveled and highly respected guy. And it just didn't make sense that he would commit any crime, let alone an unforgivable one that apparently cost him his life. And so Gustav kind of blurted out, "What crime? What did he do?" The guard explained that from day one, Edward had made lots of enemies in Abashir. He basically spent his days riding all around the city and staring at everybody and writing in his notebooks, but never talking to anybody. And so people began to gossip that maybe he was a spy. And then also, the guard said Edward had climbed their sacred mountain despite being told not to, the mountain that was literally right behind them. And then also, the guard said Edward was just totally unpleasant and just kind of a snobby person that nobody liked. But the guard said, none of that is actually what caused Edward to be punished. Edward's unforgivable crime, the one that caused his downfall, was his insatiable hunger for eggs. At every single meal, he refused all the food his noble host prepared for him and demanded eggs. In Abashir, eggs were quite rare and were considered a precious gift. And Edward demanded them at every single meal, and he ate all of that noble family's eggs. And so eventually, the nobles, they could not stand Edward's disrespect. And so they went to the king. And the king, who agreed this was just awful what Edward had done, decided the only appropriate punishment was to take Edward and drag him out to the base of that sacred mountain and literally beat him to death. Dr. Edward Vogel, the proud symbol of Germany's exploring spirit, was executed because he ate an offensive number of eggs. Gustav was unharmed. He, unlike Edward, had actually bothered to learn the local customs and was highly respectful. And so he was allowed to leave the city even after being told what happened to Edward. And he would become the first European ever to leave Abashir alive. As for Edward's notebooks and maps, they were never found. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was just after midnight, specifically around 12:30 in the morning on August 9th, 2013, when Kyle Lawson was woken up by his cell phone ringing. He was in bed with his wife at their home in San Angelo, Texas, and the sound cut right through the quiet of the night. Kyle groggily reached for the phone, squinting at the screen in the darkness. The caller ID showed it was his younger brother, 26-year-old Brandon. That was a little strange, a call this late, but he answered it. Kyle put the phone to his ear, but before he could even get a hello out, Brandon's voice came through, frantic and rushed. He said he needed help right now. And then he launched into a story that sounded completely unbelievable. Brandon told Kyle that he was driving his truck north on Highway 277. Now, this highway is a classic West Texas road, just 2 lanes stretching out into what feels like a whole lot of nothing. It's desolate, especially in the middle of the night. There aren't many lights, not much traffic, just open, empty country. And according to Brandon, he wasn't alone out there. He said there were 3 men and they were chasing him. To make things worse, he told Kyle that his truck was about to run out of gas. He was on fumes. His voice was high-pitched with panic. He was practically begging Kyle. He needed him to bring a gas can out to him to meet him somewhere along the highway so he could refuel and get away from these guys who were on his tail. He stressed that Kyle had to be secretive about it, that he couldn't let the other men see him. As Kyle listened to all of this, lying there in his bed, he wasn't really feeling scared for his brother. At least, not in the way Brandon wanted him to be. He wasn't picturing a high-speed chase with dangerous men. Instead, Kyle's main feeling was just deep, heavy annoyance. He was almost certain that there were no 3 men. He was sure that his brother Brandon was just high again and was having a paranoid, drug-induced hallucination. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. You see, Brandon had a history with methamphetamine. It was a struggle he'd been fighting for a while. For the past 6 months, he'd actually been doing really well. He'd been clean, he was working hard, and he was trying to be a better partner to his fiancée, Ledessa, and a better father to his 4 young children. He seemed to be turning a corner, and the whole family was proud of him. But just 2 days before this late-night phone call, Brandon had called Kyle for a very different reason. He had asked Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Kyle, of course, didn't give him any information. He did the opposite. He pleaded with his brother, telling him, "Don't do it, man. You're doing so good. You're clean. Don't throw it all away." But Kyle had a sinking feeling that his words hadn't gotten through. He was pretty sure that even though he hadn't helped, Brandon had found a way to get drugs anyway. Because ever since that phone call 2 days ago, Brandon's behavior had been erratic and unpredictable. He just wasn't acting like himself. In fact, the only reason Brandon was even out on Highway 277 at this hour was because he'd gotten into a huge fight with Ledessa. Kyle knew this because he'd spoken to his parents earlier in the evening. The plan was for Brandon to drive to their parents' house to cool off for the night, to get some space. He was essentially in a timeout for his bad behavior at home. So him being on this specific road at this specific time made sense in that context. But the story about being chased by 3 men, that part didn't make sense at all. Not in the real world, anyway. So, Kyle knew his brother was almost certainly high. And he also knew that trying to reason with him in this state was a waste of time. Telling him, "Brandon, there's no one chasing you, you're just high, you need to go to mom and dad's house," would be pointless. Brandon wouldn't hear it. He was in his own reality right now. So Kyle shifted his strategy. He didn't argue. He just tried to calm his brother down, to soothe the panic in his voice. He used a low, steady tone, trying to be the anchor in Brandon's storm. But it wasn't working. Brandon didn't calm down. If anything, he got more agitated, more anxious. He kept talking about the 3 men, saying they were getting closer, that he was running out of time. The desperation in his voice was escalating with every word. Finally, Kyle just had to ask the question that was hanging in the air. He said, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed?" Is that what's happening here? As Kyle expected, Brandon completely denied it. He swore up and down that he was not high, that this was real, that he was in serious trouble. He went right back to begging Kyle to come help him to bring the gas can so he could escape. "Please, Kyle, you have to hurry. They're gonna get me. Just bring the gas. Please, man, come on." At this point, Kyle felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. There was no point in continuing this conversation. Part of him just wanted to hang up the phone, roll over, and go back to sleep. He had his own life, his own family, his own responsibilities. He was a husband and a father. He couldn't spend his life babysitting his younger brother through self-inflicted crises. But at the same time, underneath the frustration, Kyle loved his brother. They were very close. And even though he was 99% sure there was no real danger from these imaginary men, there was still a tiny sliver of doubt. And what if Brandon was in danger from himself? What if he crashed his truck or wandered off into the dark? Kyle sighed. He knew what he had to do. He made a decision. He told Brandon, "Okay, I'm on my way. I'll be right there." Then he hung up the phone. About 45 minutes later, Kyle was driving north on that same dark and empty highway, 277. His wife was in the passenger seat next to him, and their 4-year-old son was asleep in his car seat in the back. His wife had insisted on coming. She hadn't wanted him going out alone in the middle of the night to deal with his brother, especially not when he was in such a strange state of mind. So now, the whole family was out on this rescue mission. As Kyle drove, he scanned the darkness on both sides of the road. This part of Texas is wide open. Even at night, you can see for a long way. The landscape is mostly flat plains, dotted with some low shrubs and a few small trees. It's the kind of place where a set of headlights or taillights would be visible for miles. It would be very easy to spot another vehicle. But Kyle saw nothing. There were no other cars. There was no truck that looked like Brandon's. There was certainly no sign of 3 other men in pursuit. The road was completely empty. He just kept driving, peering out into the darkness, checking the fields on either side just in case Brandon had somehow veered off the road. That seemed like a real possibility given the state he was in. But there was nothing. Then, finally, way up ahead, he saw it. A dark shape parked on the shoulder, half on the pavement and half on the dirt. It was a truck. The lights were off. It wasn't running. It was just sitting there, silent in the night. As Kyle got closer, he could see that it was his brother's truck. He'd found him. Kyle pulled his own car over to the opposite side of the road and parked. He turned to his wife and told her to stay in the car with their son, to lock the doors. He said he was just going to go over and talk to Brandon. In his mind, he was picturing Brandon sitting in the driver's seat, high as a kite, waiting for him. He figured he'd have a firm talk with him, get him to go to their parents' house, and this whole bizarre night would be over. The fact that there were no other cars around just confirmed his theory. The 3 men were a fantasy. But when Kyle walked across the highway and got to Brandon's truck, he peered through the driver's side window and his heart dropped a little. There was no one inside. The truck was empty. Brandon was gone. This didn't make any sense. Kyle was confused. On the entire drive out there, Brandon had been calling him repeatedly, call after call, his voice getting more and more frantic. "Hurry up, Kyle! You gotta get here! They're gaining on me! Bring the gas, man! I'm in trouble!" And now, Kyle was finally here, standing right next to the truck, and his brother was nowhere to be found. He hadn't said on the phone that he was leaving the truck. Where could he possibly have gone? Kyle started looking around the immediate area. He even crouched down and looked under the truck, feeling a bit ridiculous. Was his brother hiding? As he was standing there, trying to process this strange scene, his phone rang again. It was Brandon. Kyle, now deeply annoyed and confused, answered it with a sharp, "Brandon, where are you?" Brandon's voice came back, calm for the first time that night. He just said, "Bro, I'm right here." Kyle looked around wildly. "No, you're not. I don't see you. Your truck is here, but you're not." But just as he said that, Kyle saw a pair of headlights coming down the highway toward them. The vehicle was slowing down. As it got closer, he could see the light bar on the roof. It was a police car. A sheriff's deputy was pulling up to the scene. And as this was happening, as the police car was rolling to a stop right in front of him, Brandon's voice came through the phone with an urgent whisper. "Run away from that cop." In that split second, Kyle realized something important. Brandon had to be close by. He had to be watching this whole scene unfold. He could see Kyle, he could see his truck, and he could see the deputy arriving. But Kyle was looking all around him, out into the flat, open fields, and there was simply nowhere to hide. The landscape was barren. There were a few scattered shrubs and some small trees far off in the distance, but nothing close by that could conceal a grown man. So where was he? Kyle was getting furious. This whole thing was a ridiculous game. He knew why Brandon wanted him to run. Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest related to a drug charge. He was trying to avoid any contact with law enforcement. Kyle was already out here in the dead of night with his family in the car, trying to help his brother who was clearly not in his right mind. And now Brandon wanted him to run from the police? It was too much. Kyle was about to yell into the phone to demand that Brandon show himself, but before he could say another word, Brandon hung up. By now, the deputy had parked his cruiser and was walking over to Kyle, who was still standing next to his brother's abandoned truck. The officer introduced himself as Deputy Neal from the Coke County Sheriff's Department. He said he was responding to a 911 call from a truck driver who had reported a vehicle stranded on the side of the road. He asked Kyle if the truck belonged to him, if he was the one who needed help. Kyle knew he should tell the truth, but the instinct to protect his brother was strong. He couldn't just tell the deputy that his brother was likely high on meth, hiding somewhere in the nearby fields, and also had a warrant for his arrest. So, he made up a story. He told the deputy that the truck belonged to his brother and that his brother had called him saying he'd run out of gas. He suggested that Brandon had probably started walking down the road to find a gas station. He then asked the deputy if it would be okay if he and his family just drove up and down the road a bit to look for Brandon. Surprisingly, Deputy Neal seemed to buy it. He just said, "Yeah, that's fine." Go ahead. So Kyle walked back to his car, got in with his wife and son, and started driving farther north, away from the scene. As he drove, he kept looking in his rearview mirror. He could see Deputy Neal still parked next to Brandon's truck. Once he was sure he was far enough down the road that the deputy couldn't see him, Kyle pulled over again. He took out his phone and started calling his brother, over and over and over again, his anger growing with each unanswered call. But Brandon never picked up. At this point, it was nearly 2 in the morning. Kyle's 4-year-old son in the back seat was awake and crying. He was tired and scared. Kyle's wife was exhausted. And Kyle himself had reached his limit. He looked at his wife and said, "That's it. I'm done." Brandon was an adult. He had tried to come out and help, to get him out of whatever mess this was. But if Brandon didn't want to be found, if he wanted to hide in a field and play these games, then that was on him. Kyle had a family to take care of. He was going home. He turned the car around and drove back south, right past the spot where his brother's truck was still parked. Deputy Neal was still there, standing beside it, presumably waiting for Brandon to return. Kyle didn't stop. He just kept driving, heading home to put his son and this crazy night to bed. He figured he'd hear from Brandon in the morning with some wild story to explain everything. He was frustrated, but he wasn't yet truly worried. A little while after Kyle and his family drove past, Deputy Neal decided he couldn't just wait there all night either. He'd done a quick search of Brandon's truck. There was nothing suspicious inside. But importantly, there was no phone, no wallet, and no keys. These were the things a person would take with them if they had indeed run out of gas and decided to walk for help. The story Kyle had told seemed to hold up. So, Deputy Neal figured Brandon was fine, just off on foot somewhere. He had other calls to respond to. So, he reached into the truck, turned on the hazard lights so it would be visible to other drivers, locked the doors, and then he got back in his own car and left. The next morning, around 8 o'clock, Deputy Neal drove back out to Highway 277 on his patrol. He wanted to check if Brandon had eventually made it back to his truck. But when he got to the spot, the truck was still there, sitting exactly as he had left it, its hazard lights still blinking. Now, a little bit of concern started to creep in for Deputy Neal. It was one thing to be gone for a few hours in the middle of the night. It was another to still be gone well into the next morning. It was possible something bad had happened to Brandon while he was on foot. Maybe he got lost, or fell and hurt himself, or maybe he was even hit by a car. Deputy Neal decided he needed to follow up to try and find Brandon and make sure he was okay. He drove back to the sheriff's department to look up contact information for Brandon Lawson. But as soon as he walked through the door, another employee stopped him. They told him that while he was out, the department had received a call from a woman named Ledessa, Brandon's fiancée, and the story she told was very different from the simple ran out of gas story that Kyle had given him. Ledessa explained that she and Brandon had been fighting. She confirmed that he was supposed to be driving to his parents' house to cool off on the night he disappeared. But he never made it to his parents' house. And he never came back home to her either. No one in the family had seen or heard from him since that night. They had all been calling and texting his phone, but there was no response. Brandon was officially missing. Hearing this, Deputy Neal was surprised and, frankly, pretty angry. He felt like Kyle had lied to him, that he deliberately downplayed the seriousness of the situation. His first move was to go and talk to Kyle and the rest of Brandon's family to get the full, unfiltered story. And it quickly became clear that the family hadn't been trying to hide a crime. They had been trying to protect Brandon from his warrant and from himself. They genuinely believed, just like Kyle did, that this was another drug-induced episode and that he would eventually turn up. But now that he was truly gone, their fear was real. They told the police everything they knew, including his history of drug use. They were begging the police to find him. And so, a massive search was launched. For the next 4 days, Deputy Neal led a huge effort covering the area around where Brandon's truck was found on Highway 277. They had teams on foot, they used search dogs, they even had helicopters in the air. Some of the search teams used thermal imaging cameras, which can detect body heat, making it possible to find someone even if they are hiding or unconscious. But despite scouring this vast, open area, they found absolutely nothing. No footprint, no piece of clothing, no sign of a struggle. They also interviewed people who lived or owned property in the general area. They asked if anyone had seen a man walking, or a strange truck, or maybe even the 3 men Brandon had claimed were chasing him. But no one had seen anything out of the ordinary. It was as if Brandon Lawson had simply vanished into thin air. Faced with a total lack of evidence, the authorities came to a conclusion. They believed that given Brandon's fight with his fiancée, his active arrest warrant, and the complete absence of any sign of him, he must have fled. They decided he was not a missing person in the traditional sense, he was a person who had chosen to disappear. He wasn't in the area because he had left on his own terms. And with that, the official search was called off. It seemed like an open and shut case of a man running from his problems. That is, until Ledessa, Brandon's fiancée, walked into the sheriff's station with a piece of paper that changed everything. It was August 13th, 2013, 4 days after Brandon had disappeared. The official search had just been terminated. An officer at the Coke County Sheriff's Department sat across from Ledessa, who looked distraught. She told him that she'd been so worried she had started digging into their shared cell phone records looking for any clue. And she had found something that terrified her. She slid a printed-out call log across the desk and pointed to a single entry. The officer saw that it was a record of Brandon's calls from the night he went missing. In between all the frantic calls to his brother Kyle, there was another one, made at 12:50 in the morning. Brandon had called 911. Ledessa explained why this was so chilling. Brandon was terrified of the police. He had a warrant. He would do anything to avoid them. She knew that he had even told his own brother to run from Deputy Neal that night. For him to voluntarily call 911 himself, she said, meant that he must have believed his life was in immediate mortal danger. He must have been out of all other options. It made no sense that he would call for help and then seemingly run away from it. This was a complete shock to everyone at the sheriff's department. Up until that moment, they believed the only 911 call had come from a trucker reporting a stranded vehicle. They had no idea that Brandon himself had also called for help. It turned out that the local 911 dispatch center was a small, underfunded operation. In the confusion of the night, someone had simply failed to pass along the information about Brandon's call to the responding deputies. It was a critical error. Now that they knew about it, they had to hear it. They contacted the dispatch center and got a copy of the audio recording. When they played it, a chill went down their spines. First, Brandon's voice. He did not sound like someone who had simply run out of gas. He sounded like he was in the middle of a life-or-death situation. He was breathless and panicked. But the second thing, the most disturbing thing, was that if you listened very, very closely, you could hear what sounded like another person's voice in the background, on Brandon's end of the line, right before the call disconnected. The call went like this. The dispatcher answered, 911 emergency. Brandon's voice came through, choppy and fast. Yes, I'm in the middle of a field. A state trooper is pushing guys over. Right here, going toward Abilene on both sides. His words were jumbled, hard to understand. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chased into the woods. Some guys, the dispatcher, confused, said, "Okay, now run that by me one more time." Brandon then seemed to be talking to someone else, not the dispatcher. He said, "We're not talking to him." Then, to the dispatcher again, "I accidentally ran into them." The dispatcher asked, "Ah, you ran into them." Okay. Then Brandon said something truly chilling. "Got the first guy." The dispatcher asked, "Do you need an ambulance?" Brandon replied, "Yeah." "No, I need the cops." The dispatcher tried to clarify, "Okay. Is anybody hurt?" But there was no response. Just silence. "Hello? Hello? Hello?" The line was dead. Suddenly, this wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This might be a homicide. The reference to being chased, the other voice, the cryptic phrase, "got the first guy," it all painted a much darker picture. The search, which had just been called off, was immediately resumed, but this time it was bigger, more intense. For the next full year, law enforcement and volunteers poured countless, but they found nothing. Not a single clue. He was just gone. Eventually, the case went cold again. The authorities may have moved on, but Brandon's family never did. LaDessa hired 2 different private investigators over the years. They conducted their own extensive searches, not just around Highway 277, but all over the state, following up on any potential lead. But they also came up empty. As the years went by, Brandon's disappearance became a well-known internet mystery featured on podcasts and television shows. Theories swirled. Maybe he was just high and wandered off, falling victim to the elements or wild animals. Maybe the 3 men were real and they had kidnapped and killed him. Or maybe the original police theory was right and he had successfully started a new life somewhere else. For 9 long years, there were only questions. Then, in January of 2022, a small group of independent searchers, volunteers who had become fascinated with the case, decided to go out to Highway 277 one more time. They went back to that same area that had been searched by hundreds of people with dogs and helicopters and advanced technology. And while combing through a field right off the side of the highway, these volunteers found what all the others had missed. They found an old, weathered pair of shorts and pieces of 2 white sneakers. They immediately called the sheriff's department. Deputies arrived, secured the area, and began their own meticulous search. Not far from where the clothes were found, they discovered it. A small fragment of a human skull. The remains were sent for DNA testing, and soon the results came back. They belonged to Brandon Lawson. You would think that finding his remains would finally bring some answers. But instead, it only deepened the mystery. The location where his skull fragment was found was incredibly close to where his truck had been parked. It was in the primary search area, the very place that had been gone over with a fine-tooth comb again and again for years. How could everyone have missed it? Remember, this isn't a dense forest. It's a flat, open West Texas field. It's hard to imagine how the remains of a grown man, along with his clothing and bright white shoes, could have gone unnoticed for 9 years. So where does that leave us? We're left with 2 impossible-sounding scenarios. The first option is that for 9 years, hundreds of searchers, professional canine units, and helicopters with thermal cameras all somehow missed Brandon's body, which was lying right there in the open field where they were looking. That he was there the whole time, and everyone was simply blind to it. The second option is that he wasn't there. That during those initial searches, Brandon's body was somewhere else entirely. But if that's true, it raises even more questions. Where did he go after that 911 call? And, most disturbingly, how did his remains end up back in that field nearly a decade later? We can reconstruct his last known movements. He argued with LaDessa. He drove off, likely under the influence of drugs. His paranoia escalated until he believed men were chasing him. He called his brother for help. His truck ran out of gas. He got out and made a terrifying 911 call where he spoke of being chased and mentioned he got the first guy. He saw a deputy arrive and warned his brother to run. And then he vanished. 9 years later, a piece of him reappeared, almost exactly where his journey ended. The discovery of his remains gave his family a painful partial closure. They finally knew he was gone. But the how, the why, and the who, if there was a who, remain a profound and haunting mystery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. One afternoon in March of 2004, a 53-year-old handyman named Carl Fenwick was sitting on the floor of a vacant studio apartment. He was in a somewhat run-down apartment building where he both lived and worked, located in a coastal town in northern England called Satan, Carew. The building itself was called The Cliff, and it was perched right across the street from the ocean, offering a wide, gray view of the water. Carl was in the middle of a job, painting the apartment to get it ready for a new tenant, but he'd taken a break. He had his lunch spread out on a dust sheet beside him and was deep into one of his favorite spy novels. Carl was a huge fan of spy stories. He had a small collection of books that he would just read over and over again, finding something new in them each time. But as he was about to turn a page, a movement outside the window pulled his attention away from the book. He looked out and saw his landlady, a woman named Anne Darwin. She lived in a large Victorian house right next door to the apartment building. At that moment, she was standing in front of her house, but she wasn't alone. She was with her 2 adult sons, Anthony and Mark. What struck Carl immediately was that all 3 of them were dressed entirely in black. And each one was holding a wreath made of flowers. Feeling a bit like one of the spies from his novels, Carl stayed low and watched from the window. He saw the family of 3 walk across the street together, moving towards a grassy knoll that overlooked the sea. From his vantage point, he watched as Anne and her sons stood there for a moment, then bowed their heads. He could tell they were likely praying or sharing a moment of quiet remembrance. Then, one by one, all 3 of them tossed their wreaths into the ocean, watching as the waves carried them away. Carl knew exactly what this was about. They were honoring Anne's husband, John Darwin. 2 years earlier, John had died in a tragic kayaking accident right there in the waters just in front of their house. As Carl watched, he could see Anne's shoulders shaking. It was clear she was crying, and seeing her grief made him feel a pang of sadness himself. Carl cared deeply for Anne. Their relationship was complicated. He wasn't just her handyman and tenant, they had been secretly and romantically involved for almost 2 years, ever since he had first moved into the cliff. But Carl's connection to Anne went back much further than that. He had known her for most of his life, and, if he was being honest with himself, he had been in love with her for decades. Both Carl and Anne had grown up in a town near Satan, Carew. The very first time Carl ever saw her was on the school bus back in high school. He had been completely captivated by her, but was too shy to ever work up the courage to say hello. Soon after, he left for college, but the memory of her never really faded. After finishing his education, Carl went on to build a life of his own. He became a school teacher and started a family. But his life took a sharp downturn after he made a series of really bad real estate investments. His financial troubles spiraled into legal troubles, and eventually, it all fell apart. He ended up leaving his family and going on the run from the police. He found himself living in the woods just outside of Satan, Carew, a shadow of the man he once was. And that's when fate, or something like it, brought him and Anne back into each other's lives. One evening, he was near his campsite when he saw a car pull into a nearby parking lot. He recognized Anne at the wheel, and she looked incredibly upset. This time, all these years later, he decided to approach her. He walked over to her car and gently knocked on the window. It turned out that her husband's kayaking accident had happened only a few weeks before. She was emotionally shattered and completely overwhelmed. On top of her grief, she was also desperate for help managing the properties she and her husband had owned together. That very same night, she offered him a place to stay. She let him move into one of the empty apartments at the cliff. And once Carl was settled in, their relationship slowly blossomed into a quiet, unconventional romance. His days were spent working, fixing up the apartments in the building. His nights were spent with Anne in her house next door. Keeping their relationship a secret was strange for both of them, but they each had their reasons. Carl was terrified of being arrested. He was still a wanted man, so if anyone knew his true identity or where he was, it would all be over. For Anne, the situation was different. She felt that her family and friends expected her to be a grieving widow, possibly for the rest of her life. She was worried about what people would think if it looked like she had moved on so quickly after her husband's death. Their shared dream was that at some point, Anne could sell her properties. They would take the money, move far away together, and start a completely new life. But they both knew it was a long shot. The biggest hurdle was Carl. He would first have to figure out a way to leave the country without a valid passport and without getting arrested. Back in the apartment, Carl watched as Anne and her sons made their way back across the street and into their house. He sighed, picked up his spy novel, and went back to reading. But he wasn't just reading for pleasure anymore. As he followed the story's plot and the actions of the main character, he was making mental notes. He was actively searching for inspiration, for a clever trick or a loophole he could use. Carl was working on a grand plan, a plan that he hoped would finally allow him and Anne to escape and start their new life together. He was using these spy novels as his textbooks. A small smile crept onto his face as he thought about how brilliant his scheme was. He even imagined that someday in the future, an author might write a spy novel about him. It would take another 2 long years for Carl to finalize every detail of his plan. But finally, one morning in July of 2006, he was ready. He walked through the airport near Satan Karu, trying his best to look casual and blend in with the other travelers. He approached the ticketing counter, his heart pounding in his chest. He handed his passport to the gate agent, then glanced over his shoulder. He saw Anne standing at the back of the line. Their eyes met for just a second before she quickly looked away. They had agreed to pretend they didn't know each other, just in case something went wrong. When Carl turned back, he saw the ticketing agent staring intently at his passport. His heart rate kicked up another notch. This was the moment of truth. The passport he was using was a fake. He had meticulously created a whole new identity for himself. He had used the birth and death records of a baby who had been born in the same year as him but had died in infancy. It was an idea he'd lifted directly from one of his favorite spy novels, The Day of the Jackal, which was about an assassin who constantly changed identities. If this worked, if this agent bought the fake passport, he and Anne would be on a flight to Panama in Central America. Carl's plan was to stay there permanently. He hoped that Anne would fall in love with the place and eventually move there to be with him. He had read a travel brochure on Panama that described it as a place for schemers, dreamers, and nutcases. That description made him feel like he would fit right in. Plus, the cost of living was incredibly low compared to the UK, and it was thousands of miles away from anyone who might recognize him. It seemed like the perfect place for them to disappear. But everything hinged on this one moment. It all depended on his fake passport being convincing enough to get past this agent. After what felt like an eternity, the agent looked up from the passport, smiled, and handed it back to Carl along with his boarding pass. Carl had to physically restrain himself from letting out a huge sigh of relief. Instead, he just gave a casual thank you to the agent. As he walked away from the counter, he turned back one more time and gave a subtle wink to Anne, who was still waiting in line. After decades of just reading about international spies, Carl felt like he had finally become one. And, he had to admit, he liked the feeling a lot. Soon, he would be living full-time as John Jones, an international man of mystery. A few days later, Carl sat beside Anne in the back of a Jeep. A real estate agent was driving them through the lush Panamanian countryside. They sped along a highway that cut through the jungle, and with every mile, Carl felt more alive than he had in years. They came around a sharp bend in the road, and suddenly, the dense jungle gave way to a stunning, sandy beach. The realtor pulled the car over and told them to get out, to take a look around and see if this particular plot of land felt like it could be their new home. Carl had done the math 100 times. Once Anne sold the apartment building and combined that money with the life insurance payout she had received after her husband's death, they would have around £600,000 in savings. That was roughly 800,000 American dollars. It was more than enough to get them set up, but they would need a steady source of income in Panama as well. That's where this land came in. Carl's big idea was to buy this piece of jungle paradise and open an eco-lodge resort. These types of resorts were becoming incredibly popular in Central America. Tourists would pay good money to stay in rustic beachside cabins for a week, go canoeing, horseback riding, and trekking through the jungle. Carl also planned to build a private villa on the property just for him and Anne, right there on the beach. He led Anne down to the edge of the water and pointed across the bay to the tree line. He told her to imagine a row of beautiful cabins nestled among the trees. He described a long dock stretching out into the water with a bunch of canoes tied up to it. He talked about a path that would lead from the cabins to a horse stable hidden in the woods. Then he pointed to the opposite side of the bay and told her to picture a magnificent seaside villa, their home, where the two of them would live out their days. Anne kicked off her sandals and waded into the warm water. Carl could see it in her eyes. She was picturing it, imagining the life they could have here. For Carl, it felt like years of meticulous, risky planning were finally about to pay off. This trip had been the best week of his entire relationship with Anne. For the first time, they could act like a normal couple. They went out to dinner in public every night. They walked down the street holding hands without fear. Carl loved being John Jones. He felt a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced in a very long time. And oddly enough, even though his identity was a complete fabrication, he felt more like his old self, the person he was before all the debt and the legal problems had crushed him. By the time they got back to the realtor's office that afternoon, Anne was completely sold on the idea. She told Carl that she was taken with Panama and that yes, she wanted to move here with him. She promised that as soon as she got back to England, she would get her affairs in order and prepare for the big move. Carl was beaming. Their realtor, sensing the happy moment, grabbed a camera and took a picture of the three of them to commemorate the day they decided to change their lives forever. It took another full year for Anne to sort everything out back home. She had to sell her properties in Satan, Carew, and even more difficult, she had to tell her family that she was moving to Panama of all places. They were all shocked at first. It seemed like such a random and drastic decision, but eventually they came to understand. They believed she needed to get away from England and all the unhappy memories of her old life with John. Shortly after Anne sold the last of the properties, Carl used some of their funds to buy a condominium in Panama City. It would be a place for them to live while they were building their dream resort. And then, finally, on the 22nd of October 2007, Anne moved to Panama for good. That night, Carl picked her up from the airport and drove her to their new home. As he drove, he had to force a smile. He had recently discovered some news, some terrible news, that was going to throw their entire new life into jeopardy. He gave Anne a quick tour of their penthouse apartment, then asked her to sit down at the kitchen table. Anne immediately sensed that something was wrong. Her expression shifted from excitement to worry. Carl took a deep breath. He told Anne how excited he was to build their resort together, but then he dropped the bomb. There was one last, unexpected obstacle standing in their way. He explained that he had only learned about it a few weeks ago and had been waiting for the right moment to tell her in person. He had discovered that the Panamanian government had recently instituted new procedures for anyone moving to the country. All new residents, including English citizens, now needed to present a certificate of good conduct from the British police. This was to prove they had no criminal record. For Anne, this was no problem at all. But for Carl, it was a catastrophe. He was living in Panama as John Jones. If the authorities looked into his identity, they would very quickly discover that John Jones didn't really exist. Anne put her head in her hands and whispered, "What are we going to do?" Carl admitted that he didn't have an answer yet, but he promised her that he would figure something out. He always did. The next morning, Carl walked with Anne along a busy street in Panama City. They window shopped, but Carl's mind was racing. He was trying to think of any possible way he could get around this awful new procedure. He didn't want to live in Panama illegally. He was done with hiding. The whole point of coming here was so that he and Anne could finally live their lives together out in the open. He followed Anne into an old vintage shop where she was looking at furniture for their new apartment. As he wandered aimlessly around the store, he came across a bookshelf filled with old books. He saw a few spy novels among them. All the books were in Spanish, so he couldn't read them, but he picked one up anyway. He began flipping through the pages, just hoping for some kind of spark, some kind of inspiration. And as he stood there, an idea did come to him. But it wasn't inspired by the book in his hands. He suddenly remembered the plot of a different spy novel, one he had read more than a decade ago. At the time he read it, he had thought the central plot was absolutely insane, far too crazy to ever work in real life. But now, as he and Anne walked around the city that afternoon, he kept coming back to that idea. He started to turn it over in his mind, seeing how he might just be able to adapt it to his own situation. Finally, at dinner that night, Carl told Anne that he was pretty sure he knew how to solve their visa problem once and for all. He warned her that the idea was incredibly risky, maybe the riskiest thing they had ever attempted. But he was confident that he could pull it off. 6 weeks later, on the afternoon of Sunday, the 2nd of December 2007, Carl was back in the United Kingdom. He was wandering around the West End of London, doing his best to look utterly lost and confused. He walked through streets decorated with festive Christmas displays, looking around with a vacant expression until a concerned store clerk came over to ask if he was okay. Carl gave her a shy, hesitant smile and asked, "Why are all the Christmas decorations up?" When she told him it was because it was December, he pretended to be baffled, as if he had no idea what month or even what year it was. He claimed he didn't know where he was. He then asked the clerk for help. Just as he had hoped, the store clerk frowned with concern. She took him by the arm and escorted him to the nearest police station. Inside, she explained to the officer at the front desk that something was seriously wrong with this man. The officer smiled kindly at Carl and asked him what the problem was. Carl knew that what he did next had to be an award-winning acting performance. The success of his entire plan depended on it. He scratched at his head, looked at the officer with pleading eyes, and said that he thought he had lost his whole family. The officer's demeanor immediately became more serious. He sat up straighter and asked for his name. And for the first time in 2 years, Carl didn't say John Jones. Instead, he gave the officer his real name. Carl had come to a realization. The only way he could ever truly feel like his old self again in Panama was to actually become his old self. He needed to reclaim the identity he had left behind. But to do that without also reclaiming all his old debt and his outstanding legal problems, it was going to require one more colossal lie. Carl looked the police officer in the eye and explained that he knew his name, but that was it. He claimed he couldn't remember anything else about himself because, he said, he had amnesia. The officer just stared at him, obviously dumbfounded. He then turned and called for his supervisor. From that moment on, things started to move very, very fast, but not at all in the direction that Carl had expected. Carl had believed that by claiming amnesia, he could essentially wipe his slate clean in England. He figured he could resume his old life under his real name, make a plan to pay back his creditors now that he was in a better financial position, and then get a real, legitimate passport. With that, he and Anne could live happily and truly openly in Panama. But that is not what happened. Almost immediately, the newspapers caught wind of his incredible story, and it exploded. It made the front page. To the rest of the world, Carl had a story that was almost unbelievable. He had supposedly spent years wandering around as a homeless person, a man with no memory of his past, no knowledge of his own identity. Almost overnight, he became a massive international news sensation. The entire world wanted to know, where had this man been for the past few years? Carl had not anticipated any of this publicity. He and Anne were both horrified. Their horror turned to pure panic when 2 days later, a British newspaper published a photograph they had found on an obscure real estate website in Panama. In the picture, Carl could be seen standing next to Anne and their realtor. All three of them were beaming with happiness after a successful day of viewing properties. This photograph was very, very bad for Carl. It was irrefutable proof that he had not been wandering around the UK homeless with amnesia, just as he had told the police. But the photo was even worse for Anne. It was devastating, because it proved something far more shocking, far more terrible than simple financial fraud. This one picture unraveled a story so outlandish that it sounded like it must have come directly from the pages of a fictional spy novel. It would turn out that Anne was not the grieving widow she had pretended to be for years. And her handyman boyfriend, Carl Fenwick, was not Carl Fenwick at all. Carl's real name, the one he had given to that police officer in London when he was faking amnesia, was John Darwin. He was Anne Darwin's supposedly dead husband. The two of them had faked his death in that kayaking accident all those years ago. It was an elaborate scheme to escape his crippling debt and so that they could fraudulently claim his life insurance money. Not even their own sons knew their father was still alive. For years, they had grieved for a man who was secretly living right next door. Only Anne and, of course, John were in on the secret. John and Anne were both quickly arrested for fraud. They ended up serving more than 3 years in prison. In a strange way, John's very unhappy ending mirrors the ending of the very book he used for inspiration, The Day of the Jackal. In that novel, the assassin pulls off a series of impressive feats to change his identity and evade capture, but in the end, he still gets caught. Today's second and final story is about a man who makes an unforgivable mistake and pays dearly for it. At around noon on the 9th of October 2018, a 52-year-old Russian engineer named Oleg Bologasov sat in the common room of a tiny research station. This station was located on a remote, frozen island in Antarctica. The common room served as the general multi-purpose hangout area for the station's crew. Oleg was sitting there watching television while his coworker, a man named Sergei, sat in a chair nearby, quietly reading a book. They were both drinking alcohol and had been for a while. When they weren't on duty, there really wasn't much else to do in that isolated place besides sit around and drink. Oleg had been at the station for about 6 months at this point. He was part of a 14-person crew on a year-round research mission. Their job was to observe the island's ocean and weather patterns, collecting data for their home country of Russia. Oleg's primary responsibility was maintaining the station's machinery and equipment, which kept him busy for a good portion of the day. But there was still a significant amount of downtime, and Oleg spent almost all of it inside. Being outside in Antarctica was generally a very bad idea. The landscape was riddled with hundreds of lethal, deep ice crevasses, many of them barely visible under the snow. If you fell into one, you were dead. The fall itself could kill you, or you would simply be trapped and freeze. On top of that, there were the obviously freezing temperatures and the constant threat of violent, lethal blizzards. It was a place that was fundamentally not built for human beings. So, Oleg and his coworkers only ever went outside when their work absolutely required it. Otherwise, they were confined to the station's buildings. And inside, their entertainment options were severely limited. There was a television that only got 2 channels. There was a small gym. There was a nearby church. And there was a library. By this point in his tour, Oleg was sick of all of it. He was even tired of the library, which was a shame because he loved to read. But the library was tiny, and he had already read almost every single book on its shelves. His colleague, Sergei, who was sitting near him, also loved to read. Books were one of the few things the two men actually spent a lot of time talking about. Since Oleg couldn't find anything interesting to watch on the two-channel TV and was feeling intensely bored and stir-crazy, he decided to see if Sergei was in the mood for one of their deep, literary conversations. Oleg turned off the TV, tossed the remote onto a chair, and took a long swig of his drink. He glanced over to the corner where Sergei was absorbed in his book. He saw the cover. It was the novel Fight Club. Oleg had already read it. The book is about a depressed man suffering from insomnia who meets a charismatic stranger and starts a secret club where people just literally fight each other. Oleg thought the book was amazing, mostly because it had one of the most epic plot twists he had ever read. So, Oleg got up and walked over to Sergei. He asked him what he thought of the book so far. But Sergei just grunted and kept reading, effectively ignoring him. Oleg wasn't surprised by this. He knew Sergei very well. The two of them had worked closely together on various research projects over the years. He knew that Sergei was a generally quiet person and not a big talker, whereas Oleg loved to get into long, passionate discussions about everything and anything. Sometimes, Oleg could coax Sergei out of his shell by asking a lot of questions or telling jokes. But today did not seem to be one of those days. This was frustrating for Oleg, but he could take a hint. He could tell that Sergei just wanted to be left alone to read. So, he stood up and left the common room to go find something else to do. Oleg spent the next few hours just wandering around the station, checking some of the research logs, and continuing to sip his drink. He briefly thought about going outside just for a minute to get some fresh air. But when he checked the outdoor temperature, he saw that it was well below freezing. He decided against it. So, after 3 hours of trying and failing to kill time, Oleg finally gave up and headed to the cafeteria to get a bite to eat. It was around 3 in the afternoon when Oleg stepped into the dining room. He was feeling a bit flushed from all the booze he had been drinking all day. And the first person he saw when he got inside was Sergei. He was sitting at a table, still reading Fight Club, just as he had been doing hours earlier in the common room. Oleg got himself some food and then went over to sit with Sergei. He figured he'd try again and see if maybe now he was more open to chatting. And to his surprise, he was. When Oleg sat down, Sergei actually put his book down on the table and looked up, ready to talk. It was possible that he had also had a lot to drink by this point and was feeling a bit more sociable. So the two men began to discuss the book Fight Club. Very quickly, their conversation became really energetic. They were both a bit drunk and were getting excited about the points they were making. Then, Oleg made what he thought was a fantastic and insightful point about the book and its deeper meaning. To Oleg, it seemed like the conversation was going great. But then, all of a sudden, right after he made his point, Oleg noticed that Sergei had gone completely silent. His face had changed. Oleg, who could read Sergei very well by now, knew what this meant. Sergei was done talking. He wanted some space again. Oleg glanced down at his watch. He realized he actually did need to get some more work done before the day was over. He was about to look up and tell Sergei that he was going to go leave to check on one of their weather instruments. But when he looked up from his watch, Sergei was gone. He had vanished from the table. And at that exact same moment, a wild, agonized scream cut through the air right behind Oleg. A few minutes later, in another building at the station, the research station's manager was in his office, going through some paperwork. Suddenly, his office door flew open with a bang. The manager looked up and saw one of his employees standing in the doorway, looking absolutely panicked. The employee's eyes were wide, and his breath was coming in ragged gasps, like he was in a state of shock. When the employee managed to explain why he was so upset, the manager shot to his feet and told the man not to move. He then grabbed his heavy coat and flew out the door, into the brutal, freezing cold. The manager struggled to pull on his coat as he ran across the ice-packed ground, heading for the building that housed the cafeteria. The whole way there, he felt his own panic growing and growing. Because what that employee had just told him was something that had never, ever happened at their research station before. In fact, he wasn't even sure if it had ever happened on the entire continent of Antarctica before. When the manager finally reached the cafeteria, he flung the door open and looked inside. What he saw made him feel immediately sick to his stomach. It would turn out that Oleg and Sergei had been coworkers for a very long time. And because they knew each other so well, Oleg had learned over the years what specific things really truly annoyed Sergei. And Oleg, it seems, used this knowledge whenever he got bored and wanted to find a way to entertain himself. The way Oleg would intentionally upset Sergei was by violating a very serious, unspoken rule that virtually every human being knows not to violate. Every single time Sergei would start reading a new book, Oleg would wait until he was about halfway through, and then he would spoil the ending for him. This wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a pattern. Whenever they talked about books, Oleg repeatedly and deliberately ruined them for Sergei, which always made Sergei incredibly angry. And that day, in the cafeteria, when Oleg sat down with Sergei, he didn't just make a great point about the book Fight Club. He told Sergei exactly how it ended. He revealed the big, famous twist. And Sergei, who was very drunk and who, like Oleg, had also been feeling very restless and tense from having been cooped up in that isolated station for months on end, finally snapped. This time, when Oleg spoiled the ending, Sergei completely lost control. He went into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, walked up behind Oleg, and began repeatedly stabbing him in the chest, all while allegedly screaming, "Didn't see that coming, did you?" Once Sergei had calmed down, he was so shocked and horrified by what he had done that he immediately walked to the manager's office and turned himself in. He was then transported all the way back to Russia and arrested. He was eventually acquitted, however, since he had no previous criminal record. As for Oleg, his heart was severely damaged in the attack, but amazingly, after being evacuated to a hospital, he would survive. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In March of 2015, in the sprawling, historic city of St. Petersburg, Russia, a 8-year-old woman named Tamara Samsonova was living in a state of controlled chaos. Her apartment, the place she had called home for years, was being torn apart and put back together. Renovations. Dust was everywhere, the noise was constant, and it was becoming nearly impossible to live there. A good friend of hers, a 9-year-old woman named Valentina Olenova, heard about Tamara's situation. Valentina lived nearby and had a spare room. She felt for her friend and decided to make a generous offer. She called up Tamara and said something along the lines of, "Why don't you come and stay with me while the work is getting done?" "It's no trouble at all." Tamara was immensely grateful. It was the perfect solution. She immediately accepted, packed a few bags, and moved into Valentina's quiet, comfortable apartment. From the moment she arrived, Tamara wanted to be the perfect houseguest. She knew she couldn't afford to pay rent, so she decided to contribute in other ways. She became the unofficial housekeeper. She cleaned the apartment from top to bottom, she did all the dishes, and she made sure there was always a home-cooked meal ready for Valentina. For the first couple of weeks, things were wonderful. The two women, both in their later years, enjoyed the companionship. They'd chat in the evenings, share meals, and it felt like a comfortable, easy arrangement. Valentina was happy to help her friend, and Tamara was relieved to be out of her noisy, dusty apartment. Then, after a few weeks passed, Tamara got a call. The renovations on her home were complete. It was time for her to move back. But a strange thing had happened. Tamara had gotten used to living with Valentina. She enjoyed the company, she enjoyed their routine, and frankly, she didn't want to leave. So she approached Valentina and asked, "Would it be okay if I stayed just a little bit longer? I'm really enjoying it here." Valentina was a little hesitant. The original agreement was just for the duration of the renovations. But she was a kind woman, and she didn't want to just kick her friend out onto the street. So she reluctantly agreed. "Okay," she said. "A little bit longer is fine." But a little bit longer turned into a couple of months. Spring turned into summer, and Tamara showed absolutely no signs of packing her bags or making any plans to move back to her own apartment. Valentina's patience began to wear thin. Her home didn't feel like her own anymore. The temporary guest had become a permanent fixture, and the initial harmony had curdled into a quiet, simmering resentment. Valentina started dropping hints, asking about Tamara's apartment, wondering aloud when she might be moving back. But Tamara would just brush off the questions or change the subject. Finally, in late July of 2015, Valentina couldn't take it anymore. She decided a direct confrontation was the only way. She sat Tamara down and told her straight up, "You have to go. The renovations are done. It's time for you to go home." She expected some resistance, maybe some sadness, but she didn't expect Tamara's flat-out refusal. Tamara just looked at her and said, "No, I'm not leaving." This sparked a huge fight. Voices were raised, feelings were hurt, and the tension in the small apartment became unbearable. But at the end of it all, nothing was resolved. Tamara still refused to leave. For the next couple of days, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the apartment. The two women moved around each other like ghosts, not speaking, not even making eye contact. The air was thick with unspoken anger. This Cold War was finally broken on July 23rd over something incredibly trivial. There were a few unwashed cups left in the sink. One of them was supposed to have cleaned them, but hadn't. An argument started about whose turn it was to do the dishes. But of course, it wasn't really about the cups. It was about everything else. The argument quickly escalated, and soon, Valentina was screaming at Tamara again. "You shouldn't even be here. You need to leave my home!" And Tamara was yelling back, "No, I'm not going to leave." It was another huge blowout fight filled with bitterness and frustration. But then, something shifted. As the yelling died down, Tamara's demeanor changed. She seemed to finally accept the situation. With a sigh of resignation, she looked at Valentina and said, "Okay, I get it. I need to leave. Just give me a couple of days to get my things in order and I'll be out of your hair." Instantly, all the tension just evaporated from the room. Valentina felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, she was going to get her apartment back. The fighting was over. To seal the truce, Tamara offered a peace offering. "Look," she said, "I'll make us a special dinner tonight. I'll go out and get the food." Tamara left the apartment, but she didn't go straight to the grocery store. Her first stop was a local pharmacy. She walked in and bought a large quantity of potent sleeping pills. Then she went to the market and bought all the ingredients for a traditional Russian Olivier salad, a dish she knew was one of Valentina's absolute favorites. She returned to the apartment and began to prepare the meal. The kitchen was quiet as she chopped vegetables, but her mind was anything but. She took the sleeping pills she had just purchased, and using a mortar and pestle, she crushed them into a fine white powder. Then, as she was mixing the mayonnaise-based dressing for the salad, she carefully stirred the powder in, making sure it was completely dissolved and undetectable. She served the dinner, and Valentina, hungry and happy that their conflict was resolved, ate the entire salad. She didn't notice anything wrong. The dressing was rich and creamy, just the way she liked it. As soon as Tamara was sure Valentina had finished every last bite, she simply cleared the plates, went up to her room, and went to bed, leaving her friend in the living room. She waited. A couple of hours later, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Tamara quietly got out of bed. She crept downstairs to the kitchen. And there, on the floor, was Valentina, passed out cold. Tamara walked over and checked for a pulse. She was still breathing. For a moment, Tamara felt a flash of disappointment. She had hoped the massive overdose of sleeping pills would have been enough to kill her. But it didn't really matter. It just changed the next step of her plan. She went to a closet where she had stashed a hacksaw. She had borrowed it from a neighbor earlier that day under the pretense of needing it for a small project. Now, she brought it back to the kitchen. Standing over her unconscious friend, Tamara began the gruesome, laborious task of dismembering Valentina's body. She worked with a strange, methodical precision. As she cut her friend into pieces, she took special care to remove the lungs, making sure not to damage them. It turns out, Human lungs were a particular delicacy for Tamara. She considered them her favorite food. Once the body was in several pieces, she took Valentina's head and placed it into a large stock pot on the stove. She filled it with water and turned on the burner, beginning to boil it. While the head and the carefully preserved lungs cooked, she took the rest of Valentina's remains. She cut them into the smallest pieces she could manage, then wrapped them in a shower curtain and stuffed them into various plastic bags. The process was long and physically demanding, but Tamara worked tirelessly through the early morning hours. With Valentina's head and lungs simmering on the stovetop, Tamara began the disposal. She started making trips, dozens of them, from the apartment speed down the stairs and out the front door into the dark, silent streets of St. Petersburg. She carried the heavy bags one by one all the way down to a small lake near their apartment building where she tossed them into the dark water. Back and forth she went, trip after trip, until most of the body parts were gone. Valentina's hips and legs, however, were apparently too heavy for her to carry all the way to the lake. So, for those, she took a different route, dragging them to a nearby patch of forest and leaving them there. Her final trip was perhaps the most macabre. She carried the big silver pot from the stove. Inside was what was left of Valentina's head, after Tamara had finished eating most of it. 4 days passed. Life in the apartment building went on as normal. Then, on July 27th, a young couple who lived in the same building as Tamara and Valentina decided to take their dog for a walk near the lake. As they strolled along the path, their dog suddenly took off running. It stopped in front of a large, bulky plastic bag that had washed up near the shore. The dog began sniffing and pawing at the bag, trying to get it open. The couple called for their dog, but it wouldn't budge. It was completely fixated on the mysterious package. Annoyed, the owners walked over to see what had captured their pet's attention. The man poked the bag with his foot. It was heavy, and it felt wrong. With a sense of dread, he managed to tear it open. Inside, they found a human torso. It was Valentina's. When the police arrived, one of the first things they did was canvass the apartment building to see if anyone was missing. They quickly learned that the victim was likely Valentina Olenova. They went to her apartment to investigate and were surprised to find Tamara Samsonova living there. They approached her gently, assuming she was a grieving friend or relative. They explained that Valentina had been found deceased and that they needed to search the apartment as part of the investigation. Tamara's reaction was completely bizarre. She was totally indifferent. There was no sadness, no shock, no fear. She just calmly allowed them in, as if she knew this day would eventually come. The search of the apartment didn't take long. The officers quickly found what they were looking for. There were specks of blood all over the bathroom. There was more blood in the kitchen. They found the hacksaw she had used, still bearing traces of blood and tissue. And then they found her diary. It was sitting on a table right next to a book about black magic and the occult. When the police opened the diary, they were horrified. It wasn't just a daily journal. It was a meticulous, detailed log of ritualistic killings that Tamara had apparently been carrying out for the past 20 years. The diary described 14 different murders. According to her own writings, almost all of the killings were motivated by her desire to cast spells she was learning from her books on black magic. These spells, she wrote, required specific human components like flesh or organs. So she would kill people, use their bodies for her rituals, and then afterwards she would consume parts of them. Not because the spell required it, but simply because she said she liked the taste of human flesh. And in particular, she noted, she loved the taste of human lungs. The police arrested Tamara on the spot. She didn't put up a fight. She didn't deny anything. She looked at the officers and said, "Yep, you got the right person. I did all this." During her trial, Tamara's behavior was a spectacle. She seemed to be in a great mood, often smiling. She told the judge, "I hope you give me a really severe punishment. I expect to die in prison." She was seen blowing kisses to the reporters in the courtroom gallery. It was as if she was completely detached from the reality of her horrific crimes, or perhaps she simply didn't care anymore. Tamara, who the press quickly nicknamed the Granny Ripper, was found guilty and given a life sentence. To this day, she remains in a high-security prison, one of Russia's most notorious and chilling serial killers. After spending 21 years serving in the U.S. Army, a man retired and decided to move his family to Central Florida. He, his wife, and their young son settled into a quiet life. They had plenty of money. He had his military pension coming in every month, and his wife still worked a full-time job. But after a lifetime of structure and activity in the military, he found retirement to be incredibly boring. He just wasn't the type to sit around the house all day. So, he decided he needed to find a simple job, something to keep him occupied and give him a reason to get out of the house. He ended up taking a job as a clerk at a gas station located right off a major highway. One of the main reasons he chose this particular job was because the owners were very laid back. They didn't mind if his son came to hang out with him during his shifts. So, for years, that became their routine. The man would work his shifts behind the cash register, and his son would tag along. Even as the boy grew into a teenager, when you'd think he'd want to be off with his friends, he still came along. The town they lived in was so small and quiet, there was really nothing else for him to do. So even well into his teenage years, the son would spend his evenings at the gas station with his dad. One night in 1990, the son, who was 15 years old at the time, was taking a break. He was sitting outside at a picnic table under the bright lights of the gas station's canopy. He was reading a magazine and drinking a Mountain Dew. It was a dark, quiet night. There were no cars at the pumps, no customers inside the store, and the highway itself was mostly empty. It was in this stillness that he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A figure, a woman, was walking off the shoulder of the highway, heading directly toward the gas station. This immediately struck him as odd. He thought to himself, no one ever walks to our gas station. We're on a highway. Everybody drives here. His logical conclusion was that her car must have broken down nearby, and she was coming to use their payphone to call for a tow truck. The woman continued walking across the large, empty parking lot, getting closer and closer. The boy had turned his attention back to his magazine for a moment, but he would say later that he kept looking up, keeping an eye on her. There was just something about her, something that felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The woman walked right past the picnic table where he was sitting, not even acknowledging him. She didn't say hi, didn't make eye contact, just walked straight to the glass door and went inside the convenience store. From where the boy was sitting, the front of the store was all glass windows, so he had a clear view inside. He could see his father standing behind the counter, and he could see the top of the woman's head as she began to walk up and down the aisles. As soon as she was inside, the boy put his magazine down and just watched. He noticed she wasn't really shopping. She would walk down an aisle, look down at the shelves for a few seconds, but never pick anything up. Then she would look up towards the counter and just stare at his father for a moment before looking back down and moving to the next aisle. She did this over and over, circling the small store. At some point, the woman seemed to abandon this pretense of shopping and just walked directly up to the counter. There was still nobody else in the store, and the night was so quiet that the boy could fairly clearly hear her conversation with his father. He heard her tell his dad that her car had broken down and she needed a ride. Could he drive her to Ocala? That was the next big town north of their gas station. The boy would say later that his father's reaction was very strange. Normally, his dad was incredibly pleasant with all the customers. He was chatty and friendly with everyone who came in. But with this woman, his dad's tone was dismissive, almost rude. When she asked for a ride, he just gave a short, flat answer. No, I won't give you a ride. The woman was visibly annoyed by how quickly he had shut her down. But instead of just taking no for an answer, she did something strange. She turned and looked out the window, directly at the boy sitting on the picnic bench. He was looking right back at her. She pointed at the boy and said to his father, "What about him? Is he your son? Can he give me a ride?" The boy saw his father, who was out of the woman's direct line of sight, look at him and shake his head no very firmly. It was a clear signal. Whatever she wants from you, you say no. The boy was confused by all this. He was still trying to understand why his dad was being so hostile and unhelpful. The woman clearly needed help, or at least she claimed to. But he trusted his dad's judgment. He knew that if she came outside and asked him directly, he would say no. But it never came to that. The boy's father said to the woman in a firm, final tone, "No, my son is not going to give you a ride. You need to leave here immediately. Do not come back. Leave. We're not going to help you." The woman exploded in a fit of rage. She started cussing him out, screaming at him. She stormed towards the door, slammed it open, and stalked back out into the parking lot. She started cussing at the boy as she passed him. The whole time she was walking away, back towards the dark highway, she kept turning around, flipping them both off and screaming profanities. The father had come out from behind the counter and was now standing next to his son, watching her go. As she disappeared into the darkness, the boy turned to his dad and asked, what was her deal? Why did you not want to help her? The dad just shook his head. I don't know, he said. There was just something off about her. I can't explain it, but I did not want her around you. I knew I didn't want to give her a ride. I just knew she had to go. They didn't talk about it much after that. It was just a weird, uncomfortable encounter on an otherwise normal night. A year went by. The boy was in his room at home one evening when he heard his dad yelling from the living room, a sense of urgency in his voice. Come in here! You have to see this! Look at the TV! The boy ran into the living room, and on the television screen, there was a news report. And on the screen was a mugshot. It was the same woman from the gas station. Her name, the reporter said, was Aileen Wuornos. She was a serial killer who targeted men she met along the highways of Florida. The news report detailed how she would get her male victims to pick her up, often at gas stations, before robbing and killing them. The boy and his father stood there, staring at the screen in stunned silence. The chilling realization washed over them. It's unclear if the boy or his father were intended to be her next victims that night. But by the time she had walked into their gas station, she had already killed 4 men. And following that strange, tense interaction with them, she had gone on to kill 3 more people. One of those victims was found in Ocala, Florida, the very town she had asked them for a ride to. Aileen had been caught, which is why her face was on the news. She was later sentenced to death for her crimes. The boy and his father never forgot that night, the night a serial killer walked into their lives, and a father's unexplainable gut feeling may have saved them both. In the early evening of the 7th of May, 2008, a 65-year-old woman named Zvonka Telemakaska was in the kitchen of her small apartment in Kisevo, a quiet city in the southeastern European nation of North Macedonia. Kisevo is a peaceful place, nestled at the base of a huge mountain. It's beautiful, but also very remote. It's the kind of town where everybody knows everybody, and nothing of real note ever seems to happen. Zvonka worked as a cleaning lady to make ends meet. But on this particular day, she had the day off. She was just relaxing at home, waiting for her adult son, Zoran, to come over for dinner. It was a beautiful, warm spring evening, so Zvonka had the kitchen windows open as she moved about, preparing a simple meal for herself. At some point, her phone rang. She picked it up and answered, hearing the voice of a friend on the other end. But her friend's voice sounded strange. It was strained, panicked. The friend asked Zvonka if she was watching the news or listening to the radio. Zvonka said no and asked why. The friend then told her that there was a breaking news story all over the local channels. There had been a huge, terrible traffic accident right there in their town. And the friend said the reports were saying that Zvonka's son, Zoran, was involved. Zvonka let out a strangled cry. She dropped whatever she was holding, and without a second thought, she turned and ran out the front door of her apartment. As she burst outside, her next-door neighbor, who happened to be outside, saw her emerge looking frantic. The neighbor called out, "Hey, is everything okay?" Zvonka, who was already running towards the main road, just blurted out over her shoulder that her son was hurt and she was going to the hospital. The neighbor watched as Zvonka ran down the street, turned a corner, and disappeared from sight. Zvonka didn't own a car, so she was literally going to run all the way to the hospital to get to her son. A little while later, that same neighbor heard a knock on their door. The neighbor went and opened it and was completely shocked by who was standing on the doorstep. It was Zvonka's son, Zoran. He didn't have a scratch on him and didn't appear to be hurt in any way. Before the neighbor could even process what was happening, Zoran, who looked visibly confused, asked, "Hey, have you seen my mom? We were supposed to meet for dinner, and it's totally unlike her to just disappear without telling me where she was going." The neighbor just stared at Zoran for a second, trying to make sense of the situation. Then the neighbor asked, "Wait a minute, Zoran, were you in a car accident?" Zoran just looked back at them, completely bewildered. "No," he said. "What are you talking about?" The neighbor then explained what had happened just a short while ago. They told him how his mother had run out of her house in a panic, saying he had been in an accident and that she was running to the hospital. Now, it was Zoran's turn to be confused. He pulled out his phone and immediately called the local hospital to see if his mother was there. But when the hospital staff answered, they told Zoran two things. First, his mother was not there. She hadn't been there at all that day. And second, while they had heard rumors about a car accident in town, no victims from any such accident had been brought to the hospital. By the end of the night, Zoran had no idea where his mother was, what had happened to her, or what this whole story about a car accident was about. He did the only thing he could think to do. He went to the police and reported his mother, Zvonka, missing. 9 days later, on May 16th, Zvonka was still missing. The police had no leads, no new information, nothing. On that day, a 5-6-year-old local reporter named Vlado Teneski, who happened to live not far from Zvonka, got a call from one of his confidential sources inside the police department. The source told him something that wasn't yet public information. Zvonka had just been found. And unfortunately, she was dead. Her body, which had been brutally beaten, strangled, and stabbed, had been found wrapped in plastic bags and dumped in an illegal garbage dump not far from the town's football stadium. The source also told Vlado that when her body was found, she still had her valuables on her, which seemed to rule out robbery as a motive. This was the part that puzzled the police. When they had started looking into Zvonka's life, they discovered she was just a poor, elderly cleaning lady. She had no known enemies. It made absolutely no sense that she would be the victim of such a brutal, personal, and violent murder that wasn't financially motivated. Vlado thanked his source for the information and hung up the phone. His source had sounded completely shocked by the murder, but Vlado wasn't so much shocked as he was suspicious. He felt like something about the official story was off. Maybe on the surface, Zvonka was just a poor cleaning lady with no enemies, but maybe she was leading a secret life that got her killed. Or maybe she had stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to see. Vlado had no idea, but his reporter's intuition was telling him there was a much bigger story here and it needed to be investigated. Vlado had a reputation in Kisevo for being an aggressive, fearless journalist. He wasn't afraid to dive headfirst into murky stories involving corruption or abuse of power. He would regularly publish articles that were highly critical of the government, the police, or anyone in a position of authority. As a result, over his 30-year career, he had been threatened with violence many times for the things he had written. But even though Vlado knew this Zvonka murder case had the potential to put him in hot water again, he felt it was his duty to get to the truth. Feeling determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen, walked out of his house, and made the short walk over to Zvonka's apartment. When he got there, her son, Zoran, opened the door. Soon, the two men were sitting in the kitchen, and Zoran was telling Vlado the whole strange story. He told him about the planned dinner, about finding his mom gone, and about the neighbor's bizarre story of her running to the hospital because of a non-existent car accident. As Zoran spoke, Vlado took meticulous notes, asking pointed follow-up questions. By the end of the interview, Vlado felt like he had a pretty good working theory about what had really happened to Zvonka. And the key to his theory was something Zoran had told him about his mother, that she was a cleaning lady. It took Vlado a couple of days to put his story together. He interviewed dozens more people in the neighborhood. Finally, on May 19th, just 3 days after Zvanka's body was found, Vlado published his story in the newspaper. The headline was "Explosive: A serial killer stalks Kosovo." In the article, Vlado argued that Zvanka's murder was very likely not an isolated killing. Instead, he wrote, her murder was probably linked to the murders of 2 other women in their town. And these 2 other victims looked an awful lot like Zvanka. Not just in appearance, but in their lives. They were also poor older women who worked as cleaning ladies. This was the connection Vlado had made while interviewing Zoran. When Zoran described his mother, her age, and her profession, Vlado's mind had immediately gone to these other unsolved cases. The other 2 victims were 6-4-year-old Mitra Simjanoska, who was murdered in 2005, and 5-6-year-old Ljubica Lakoska, who was murdered in 2007. Vlado's story was a bombshell. It was the first time anyone had publicly suggested that a serial killer was operating in their quiet little town. But the story was also explosive for another reason. Vlado was intensely critical of the police. He pointed out that the murders in 2005 and 2007 had been completely mishandled. An arrest had even been made in one of the cases, but clearly, Vlado argued, they had arrested the wrong person because the killer was still out there. When the police read Vlado's story, they were furious with him for his public criticism. However, they also had to admit that Vlado had uncovered a lot of details from his interviews that did seem to point towards the possibility of a serial killer. So, based almost entirely on Vlado's reporting, the police officially linked all 3 murders and began a new, high-priority investigation into a potential serial killer in their midst. But at the same time, Vlado began to notice something strange. He was being followed. Wherever he went in town to do his job, there would be a police officer standing somewhere in the distance, just watching him. Vlado figured this was their way of intimidating him, a form of blowback for his critical article. He just accepted it as part of the job and continued his work. By early June, about 2 weeks after Zvanka's body was found, the police's new serial killer investigation had narrowed its suspect pool from hundreds of people down to just 3. They felt they were very close to making an arrest. About a month later, on June 20th, Vlado was still being tailed by police, and the police had not made any public statements about the case. That day, Vlado's editor at the newspaper got a call from a police officer. The officer told the editor that they were about to make an arrest in the serial killer case. As soon as the call ended, the editor tried to phone Vlado to give him the scoop. But Vlado didn't pick up, which was very unusual. Vlado always answered his phone. The editor also thought it was strange that the police source had called him, the editor, instead of Vlado, the reporter who had broken the story wide open. The editor tried calling Vlado several more times, but he never answered. The editor eventually just assumed that Vlado must have already heard about the imminent arrest from his own sources and was probably already on scene, ready to report on it. Meanwhile, on a quiet street in Kosovo, police had surrounded a modest 2-story home. It was overgrown with tall fir trees, and all the windows were covered with heavy drapes. Once the house was completely surrounded, a team of officers walked up to the front porch, knocked loudly on the door, and yelled for whoever was inside to come out with their hands up. For a moment, there was just tense silence. Then, the officers on the porch heard footsteps inside. They readied their weapons. The door slowly opened, and a man, who seemed unthreatening and confused, stepped out onto the porch. The police immediately arrested him and took him away. A few minutes later, back at the newspaper office, Vlado's editor got another phone call. It was the same police officer. This time, the officer was calling to say that the arrest had been made. They had caught their serial killer. Then, he told the editor the name of the person they had arrested. When the editor heard the name, he dropped the phone in shock. The serial killer was Vlado Tedeschi. It turned out that while Vlado appeared professional and calm on the outside, he was filled with an inner rage, specifically directed at his own mother, who had died in 2002 and who he viewed as a cruel and terrible person. After her death, he became obsessed with getting some kind of twisted revenge on her memory. His method was to find and kill random women who reminded him of his mother, poor, older, and working as cleaning ladies. All three of his victims, Mitra, Ljubika, and Zavanka, had actually known Vlado's mother personally. He had used that connection to gain each woman's trust before luring them to their deaths. Vlado had manipulated the entire narrative. In his explosive newspaper story, he had made things up to throw the police off his trail. For example, he invented a witness who claimed to have seen Zavanka get into a car with two men right before she vanished. That was a complete lie. He was also the one who had planted the fake story on the radio about Zoran's car accident. He had called his former colleagues at the radio station, and they had trusted him and broadcast the story without fact-checking. It was a deliberate, calculated trap to lure Zavanka out of her home. But what ultimately got Vlado caught was his own arrogance. In the very article that made him famous, he included specific details about the crime scenes that the police had never released to the public. For example, Vlado wrote that all three victims had been strangled with telephone cords that were left at the scene. This was a detail only the killer could have known. When the police read that, they immediately became suspicious of Vlado. The police officers who Vlado thought were tailing him to intimidate him were actually tailing him because he was their prime suspect. Eventually, they covertly obtained a DNA sample from him, and it was a match to evidence found at the crime scenes. He was the killer. After his arrest, Vlado was charged with 2 of the murders, and police were preparing to charge him with the 3rd, and were even looking into a possible 4th victim. But on June 23rd, just 3 days after his arrest, Vlado was found dead in his jail cell. The circumstances were bizarre. He had apparently drowned in a small bucket of water. There were 3 other inmates in the cell with him, all of whom claimed they didn't see or hear a thing. Officially, Vlado's death was ruled a suicide. And with his death, all of the murder investigations were closed forever. On a late winter afternoon in 1985, a Canadian border security guard stood at his post, watching the line of cars waiting to cross from New York State into Ontario, Canada. As he looked out at the faces of the travelers, he felt a heavy sense of responsibility. His job wasn't just about checking passports and asking about declared goods. It was about being a gatekeeper, about making sure that dangerous criminals from the United States didn't use Canada as a hiding place. And on this particular day, there was one very specific, very dangerous criminal he was on high alert for. His name was Alex Mangal. He was 30 years old. Just a few days earlier, Alex Mangal had been pulled over for a routine traffic stop by a police officer near New York City. During that stop, things had gone horribly wrong. Alex had somehow managed to get the officer's gun, and he had shot the officer in the head, killing him instantly. Alex then fled the scene and had been on the run ever since. Law enforcement on both sides of the border was on high alert. New York was only a 6-hour drive from the Canadian border, and authorities were deeply concerned that Alex would try to slip into Canada to escape. So, an alert had been sent out to all border security personnel. They were to be on the lookout for a 30-year-old white man with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. All day long, that Canadian border guard scrutinized every person who drove up to his checkpoint. He looked closely at every driver, every passenger. He saw a family on their way to visit relatives. He saw a young couple who said they were on their honeymoon. He saw a man whose car was packed to the brim with camping supplies. He saw a middle-aged woman traveling by herself. He saw dozens of different people from all walks of life. But none of them matched the description of Alex Mangal. By the end of his long shift, after checking car after car, he felt confident that the cop killer had not passed through his checkpoint. He clocked out and went home. A few days later, on March 2nd, a police officer was on patrol in a large shopping mall parking lot in Ontario, Canada, about an hour and a half's drive from the border. As he was making his rounds, he noticed a particular car, a white Toyota, that seemed to be just loitering in the area for a long time. His suspicion peaked, he decided to drive over and check it out. As he pulled up alongside the Toyota, he looked inside and saw someone sitting in the passenger seat. It was a white man who looked to be in his 30s, with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. The officer immediately recognized him from the wanted posters. It was Alex Mangal. The officer grabbed his radio and called for backup, then he parked his cruiser, got out, and with his gun drawn, he cautiously approached the white Toyota. As he got closer to the passenger side door, the man inside turned and saw him. In a flash, the man jumped over into the driver's seat, fired up the engine, and the Toyota screeched out of the parking spot, speeding away. The officer sprinted back to his car and took off in pursuit. Within minutes, it seemed like the entire Toronto police force had joined the high-speed chase. They managed to funnel the fleeing car down a dead-end street. The white Toyota crashed into a stop sign, and the man with the mustache and thinning brown hair jumped out. At that point, cornered and with nowhere to go, he gave up without a fight. He was taken into custody. Law enforcement was incredibly relieved to have the dangerous cop killer in custody. But they were also completely baffled. How did Alex Mangal get past border security? Every single guard was on high alert, looking for a man with his exact description. How did he slip through? The police had no answers until they searched the white Toyota that Alex had been driving. Here is what they figured out. On the night Alex shot and killed the police officer, he had fled into a nearby wooded area and hidden there overnight. The next day, he was walking around and happened to pass by a commercial building. He saw a middle-aged woman named Beverly Capone come out of the building and walk towards her car in the otherwise empty parking lot. Alex approached her, abducted her at gunpoint, and forced her to drive to an isolated cabin he knew of deep in the woods. Once they were there, he murdered her. And then, he did something truly monstrous. After she was dead, he stole her clothes and put them on. And then, he cut off her face and her scalp, and he wore them as a mask and a wig. He was literally wearing her skin and her hair. Dressed as a middle-aged woman, he got into her white Toyota and drove the 6 hours north to the Canadian border. He pulled up to the checkpoint, and he got through without anyone giving him a second look. It turned out that the Canadian border security guard, who had been so diligently looking for Alex Mangal all day, had in fact seen Alex Mangal. He just didn't recognize him. Because when Alex Mangal drove up to the checkpoint, he was wearing Beverly Capone's face, her hair, and her clothes. The guard saw what he believed was just a middle-aged woman traveling alone, and he waved him through into Canada. The police pieced this all together when they searched the white Toyota after his arrest. Lying on the floorboard of the car, they found Beverly's dress, her scalp, and her face. Alex was deported back to the United States to stand trial for the murder of the police officer. However, before he could face justice, he attempted to escape from a prison transport vehicle. In the ensuing chaos, he was shot and killed by police. But that wasn't the end of Alex's story. Following his death, investigators continued to look into his past and search his property. During one of these searches, they made a disturbing discovery. They found a collection of photographs of unidentified women, along with several maps of New York and Pennsylvania. On these maps, various isolated remote locations were circled. No one knows what these maps or photos mean. Police have never been able to conclusively link Alex to any other murders, but he remains a person of interest in several unsolved disappearance cases. In fact, many investigators believe that Alex Mangal wasn't just a cop killer. They believe he was actually a serial killer. But because he took all of his secrets to the grave, we will probably never know for sure how many people he actually killed. On the morning of the 2nd of February 2012, a young man pulled his car off a 4-lane highway in Anchorage, Alaska, and into a large, snowy parking lot. He drove past dozens of parked cars until he reached a small, standalone shack that was painted a bright teal color. This was a popular drive-through coffee shop called Common Grounds, and the young man worked there as a barista. After he parked, he walked up to the white employee entrance door, pulled out his key, and went to unlock it. But as he turned the key, he realized the door was already unlocked. He knew the person who had worked the closing shift the previous night. It was an 1-8 year-old girl named Samantha Koenig. She had only been working at Common Grounds for about a month, but she always seemed very responsible. She had never forgotten to lock up before. The young man shrugged it off. People make mistakes. He pushed the door open and went inside. Right away, he noticed that things seemed out of place. The small kiosk was a mess. It looked like Samantha had just left in the middle of her shift without cleaning up at all. There were napkins scattered on the floor, used towels were left out on the counter, and dirty cups were still sitting by the espresso machine. As the young man walked over to the cash register to get it ready for the morning rush, he tried to run through scenarios in his head that could explain why Samantha had been so sloppy. He reached down with his key to unlock the cash register, and just like the front door, it was already unlocked. He pulled out the cash tray. All the money was gone. And that's when it hit him. They had been robbed. He immediately picked up the phone and called his boss. The night before, Samantha had arranged for her boyfriend, Dwayne, to pick her up after her shift ended. Dwayne arrived at the Common Grounds kiosk at around 8:30 p.m., which was 30 minutes after her shift was supposed to be over. He had gotten held up at his own job, which was why he was late. When he pulled into the parking lot, he looked around for Samantha but didn't see her anywhere. The coffee shack itself was completely dark. It looked like it had been closed up for the night. Dwayne got out of his truck and walked through the freezing cold air up to the kiosk's service window. He pressed his face against the cold glass and peered inside, but he couldn't see anyone. His mind immediately went to the fight they'd had earlier that night over text message. She had accused him of cheating on her, and he had been dismissive about it, which had led to a really ugly argument. As Dwayne walked back to his truck, he thought to himself, maybe Samantha just didn't want to see him because of the fight. Maybe she had called her dad or a friend to get a ride home at the end of her shift, and that's why she wasn't here waiting for him. He got back inside his truck and sent a text message to Samantha asking if she was okay and if she had gotten home. But after several minutes passed with no response, his worry started to grow. Even though they were fighting, he cared deeply about her. He decided he had to go by her house just to make sure she was there and that she was safe. A few minutes later, he pulled up to her house and knocked on the door. Her father, James, a single dad, answered. Dwayne explained that he couldn't find Samantha after her shift and was just checking to see if she was home. But James said, "She's not here. I haven't spoken to her. I have no idea where she is." The two men went into James's kitchen and sat down at the table. They both started calling and texting Samantha, trying to figure out where she was. After a couple of minutes, Dwayne's phone lit up. It was a text message from Samantha's number. The message made it clear that she was still very angry with him. It said that she needed some time to think and that she was going to stay with some friends for a couple of days. It also asked if he, Dwayne, would please let her father know where she was. Dwayne showed the text message to James. Samantha's father read it and immediately felt that something was wrong. This was very uncharacteristic of his daughter. He had raised Samantha on his own since she was 2 years old, and they were incredibly close. They told each other everything. It made no sense that she wouldn't contact him directly to say she was going to be with friends. And it made even less sense that she would be ignoring all of his worried phone calls and text messages. The two men stayed up late into the night, calling and texting, hoping for another message from Samantha, but she never responded again. The following morning, with still no word from his daughter, James went to the Anchorage Police Department and filed a missing person report. After receiving the report, an Anchorage police officer called the owner of the Common Grounds coffee shop to ask about Samantha. The owner said that, coincidentally, she had just gotten a call from her morning barista informing her that the kiosk had been robbed overnight and that no one had been able to get in touch with Samantha. The owner told the officer that as soon as she could get the security footage from the previous night, she would send it over to the police. While they waited for the footage, some officers started calling Samantha's friends and family, but no one had seen or heard from her. Other officers went to the Common Grounds kiosk to investigate the scene. They found no signs of a struggle either inside or outside the small building. They also noted that there was a silent panic button located under the counter, which had not been pressed. So, even though Samantha's father felt that her final text message was strange, the police began to operate under the initial theory that Samantha had robbed the kiosk herself and had run away. But this theory had problems. What confounded the police was how Samantha would have physically left the area. She didn't have a car that night, and the weather was brutally cold, far too cold to have just walked away. Anchorage isn't a very walkable city to begin with. And if she really was just taking a few days to be with friends, why did none of her friends know where she was? This question was answered later that day when the owner of the coffee shop sent over the security footage. The footage, which had no audio, started around 8 p.m. on February 1st, the night Samantha went missing. It showed Samantha inside the kiosk, working alone. She seemed cheerful, busy, serving customers. Then, at some point, someone who is just out of the camera's view comes up to the window and orders a drink. Samantha turns to them, acknowledges the order, and then turns her back to make the drink. When she finishes, she turns back to the window to hand it to the person, and in that instant, her entire demeanor changes. She immediately steps back and puts her hands up in the air. A few seconds later, she reaches over and turns off all the lights inside the kiosk, plunging the interior into darkness. Then, she gets down on her knees with her back to the window. She stays in that position, unmoving, for about a minute. Then, she slowly stands up and walks towards the cash register. She opens it, scoops out all the money, walks back to the window, and appears to hand the cash to a shadowy figure on the other side. Then, Samantha turns and kneels down again, with her back to the window. 2 more minutes pass. Then, the person outside the window leans their entire upper body through the small service window. They reach down and appear to be tying Samantha's hands behind her back. Because it was so dark inside the kiosk, the footage is extremely grainy, making it impossible to identify the person. But it's clearly a male, wearing a large hooded sweatshirt with the hood up and a hat pulled down low over his face. After he's finished tying Samantha's hands, the man leaps entirely through the window, landing inside the kiosk. He then shuts the window behind him. He pulls Samantha to her feet, puts what looks like a gun into her back, and marches her towards the employee door. He leads her out the door, across the snowy parking lot, to a white pickup truck. He puts her inside, and they drive off into the night. Over the next couple of days, the police and the FBI, who were now involved, hit one dead end after another. They had no physical evidence, no fingerprints, nothing. All they had was the grainy surveillance footage that didn't show the kidnapper's face. Meanwhile, Samantha's father, James, rallied the entire city of Anchorage to help search for his daughter. His passionate efforts attracted national news coverage, and soon Samantha's story was everywhere. Strangers donated thousands of dollars to a reward fund for information leading to her whereabouts. But despite the growing reward and the national media attention, no one came forward with any useful information. And there was still no word from Samantha or her captor. Then, on February 24th, 3 weeks after Samantha had been taken, Dwayne got another text message from her phone. It directed him to a specific sign in a nearby public park. Dwayne and James immediately shared the text with the police and then raced to the park, actually getting there about 15 minutes before the authorities. They walked through the gates, down a main trail, and stopped in front of the sign. It was a community bulletin board, and tacked to the board was a Ziploc bag. Inside the bag was a typed ransom note. And Xeroxed onto the note was a black and white photo of Samantha. In the photo, Samantha looked dazed. She had a blank expression on her face, and she wasn't looking directly at the camera, but just off to the side. In the photo, a man's hand was visible, holding up a copy of the Anchorage Daily News newspaper, dated the 13th of February, 2012. It was a proof-of-life photo. Her captor was proving that she was still alive as of 11 days ago. For James and everyone involved, this was a small, agonizing bit of relief. At least, she had been alive last week. The ransom note demanded that James deposit $30,000 into his daughter's bank account. If he did, she would be released 6 months later. On the advice of the FBI, James deposited a small portion of the ransom money into Samantha's account. Then, the FBI just waited and watched. They knew that if anyone tried to use her debit card, they could track the location of the transaction. A few days later, 3 separate withdrawals were made from ATMs within Anchorage. Each time, the FBI was notified and rushed to the location, but whoever was making the withdrawals was long gone by the time they arrived. Security footage from the ATMs showed a man wearing a ski mask and large sunglasses, making it impossible to identify him. After those 3 withdrawals, the account went silent for over a week. There was still no word from Samantha. Then, on March 7th, more withdrawals were made, but this time they were in Arizona, then Mexico, and then Texas. Again, authorities would rush to the ATMs, but they were always just a few minutes too late. But this time, they got a break. In one of the surveillance videos from a Texas ATM, they spotted the car the masked man got into before he drove away. It was a small white sedan, a Ford Focus, and they saw him get on a highway heading east. An alert was put out to law enforcement in that part of Texas to be on the lookout for that car. On March 13th, a Texas state trooper spotted the white Ford Focus parked in a hotel parking lot. He waited nearby. A short time later, a man in his 30S came out of a hotel room, walked to the car, and got in. The trooper followed him as he pulled out onto the road. He was looking for any reason to pull him over. He clocked the car with his radar gun and saw it was going 2 miles per hour over the speed limit. That was enough. He flipped on his lights and pulled the car over. The trooper walked up to the driver's side window. The man inside was calm. The trooper asked for his license. The man handed him an Alaska driver's license. His name was Israel Keys. He was 34 years old, and he lived in Anchorage. The trooper knew this was their guy. He called for backup, and soon, Keys was in custody. A search of his car turned up a ski mask, clothes that matched the description from the ATM videos, a gun, Samantha's cell phone, and her debit card. After his arrest, Keys initially denied any involvement in Samantha's disappearance. But when presented with the overwhelming evidence against him, he caved. He said he would tell them the whole story of what happened to Samantha, but only if they met his demands: an Americano coffee, a peanut butter Snickers bar, and a cigar. Once the investigators provided these items, he began to talk. And the story he told was so disturbing, so graphically violent, that the FBI has still not released the full transcript of his confession to the public. Here is what happened, based on the details that have been made public. On February 1st, Israel Keys had decided to rob the Common Grounds coffee kiosk. He walked up to the window expecting to find a teenager working inside, and he was right. It was Samantha. He ordered an Americano. But as she turned her back to make his drink, his plan suddenly changed. He wasn't just going to steal money. He was going to steal Samantha. When she turned back and handed him the drink, he pulled out his gun and told her it was a robbery. He forced her to turn off the lights, get on the ground, and hand over the money. Then he tied her hands, jumped inside the kiosk, stuffed napkins in her mouth to keep her quiet, and marched her out to his truck. Once they were in the vehicle, he told her that if she tried to escape or scream, he would kill her. He said she was very obedient and composed, despite being terrified. Keys then took her phone and sent the text message to her boyfriend, Dwayne, creating the lie that she was with friends. He told Samantha he was holding her for ransom. She told him her family was poor and they wouldn't be able to pay much. Keys replied, "Don't worry, they'll find a way." He drove around Anchorage for hours, then eventually went back to his own house. He made Samantha lie down in the back seat and covered her with tarps, telling her he would kill her if she moved. Then he went inside his house, where his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were fast asleep. He was scheduled to leave with his daughter in just a few hours for a 2-week-long luxury cruise to New Orleans. Keys went back out to his truck, put a blindfold on Samantha, and led her to a shed in his backyard. Inside, he sat her on a bucket and tied a rope around her neck, anchoring it to the wall behind her so she couldn't move. He cranked up a radio to mask any noise she might make, and told her again that he would kill her if she screamed. He gave her a couple of cigarettes and told her everything was going to be fine, that as soon as he got the ransom money, he would let her go. He turned on a couple of space heaters to keep her from freezing, then he left and locked the shed door. He went back inside, had some wine, and then a little while later went back out to the shed with a cup of water for her. He told investigators that Samantha asked him if he had spoken to her father about the ransom. Keyes lied and said yes, that everything was going according to plan. Then, in a moment of unimaginable cruelty, he untied her wrists and took the rope from around her neck. For a brief second, Samantha must have thought her nightmare was over. But then, Keyes grabbed her and tied her up again, much more tightly this time. He told investigators he just wanted to see the look on her face when she realized she was never going to be let go. He said that as he was tying her up the second time, she had a look of total resignation. She knew what was about to happen. After tying her up, he went back inside one last time to make sure his daughter and girlfriend were still asleep. They were. He went back to the shed. He assaulted Samantha. Afterwards, as he was getting dressed, she looked up at him and asked, "Are you going to kill me?" He said, "Yes, I am." Shortly before 4 a.m., he killed her. He told investigators she never made a sound. After she was dead, he left her body in the shed, went inside his house, and took a shower. Then he woke up his daughter and told her to get ready for their trip. While she was getting ready, he went back out to the shed, rolled Samantha's body in a tarp, and pushed it into a corner. He turned off the heaters and the music, locked the shed, and went back inside to make his daughter breakfast. At 5 a.m., a taxi picked them up, and they left for the airport to begin their 2-week vacation. When he returned from the cruise, Keyes went back into the shed. He unrolled Samantha's body from the tarp. He then dressed her in new clothes, applied makeup to her face, braided her hair, and then used thread to stitch her eyelids open to make it look like she was alive and alert in a photograph. He held up the newspaper next to her and took the picture that would become the proof-of-life photo in the ransom note. After that, he dismembered her body and dumped the pieces in a frozen lake nearby. It turned out Samantha was not Israel Keyes' first victim. He was a prolific serial killer who preyed on completely random people for the thrill of it. For years, he had been burying kill kits all over the United States. These were caches filled with guns, zip ties, and tools for disposing of bodies. This way, no matter where he was in the country, if he got the urge to kill, he could just dig up his nearest kit and go hunting for a random stranger. He told investigators that the moment he saw Samantha in the coffee kiosk, he knew he was going to kill her. The robbery, the ransom, it was all just an elaborate lie to control her and give her false hope. Keyes admitted to killing Samantha and an older couple in Vermont, but in December of 2012, before he could name any of his other victims, he took his own life in his jail cell. To this day, no one knows for sure how many people Israel Keyes killed. The best guess, based on a drawing of 11 skulls that he made in his cell, is at least 11. But it's just a guess. The true number of his victims is a secret he took to the grave. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.